Hey there, welcome to Brad Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. This happened about 3 months ago, and I still get a cold sweat thinking about it. I don't know if I was just too calm or if I was being stupid, but this whole thing really messed with my sense of safety at home. I'm a 31-year-old guy living alone in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Richmond, Virginia. I'm pretty chill about my surroundings. I make sure to lock everything up and check the windows, and I'm pretty aware of what's going on around me. I don't usually get rattled, but this time, it's still hard to shake. It started on a regular Tuesday night. I was coming home late after work, around 10:30. The neighborhood was dead quiet, and I parked my car in the garage like I always do. I got out, went inside, and sat down to relax. An hour later, I realized I needed to grab something out of the car. Nothing major, just a jacket I'd left in the back seat. I didn't think much of it, but when I walked out into the garage, something immediately felt off. The first thing that caught my attention was the smell. A musty, old, almost damp smell that didn't belong. I figured it was just the old garage, but it didn't sit right with me. I flipped on the light and looked around, expecting to see nothing more than my usual mess. Boxes, tools, my Toyota Camry. But then I saw him. He was crouching in the far corner, hidden behind a stack of old moving boxes, barely visible. He didn't move when I walked in. He was just there. My first instinct was to freeze, but I didn't. I've never been the type to panic, and right then, I made a choice. I wasn't going to hide or lock myself in the house. I wasn't about to let some stranger think they could just come into my space uninvited. So without missing a beat, I walked straight toward him. I didn't shout or make a scene, but I made it very clear I wasn't backing down. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, my voice firm. I wasn't about to show any weakness. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at me from behind the boxes. "Get out of my garage," I said, now just a few feet away from him, keeping my cool but not backing down. The guy didn't make a move. He didn't even flinch. That's when I really started to get pissed off. "Are you seriously going to make me drag you out of here?" I asked, stepping closer. I wasn't playing games anymore. I wanted him out, and if he didn't leave on his own, I was ready to force him out. That's when he finally moved. He stood up slowly, his hands raised as if he was trying to show he wasn't armed. "I'm not here to hurt you," he muttered, but his words did nothing to ease the situation. I didn't care if he wasn't armed. This guy was in my space, hiding in my garage, and that alone made him dangerous. "Then why the hell are you hiding in my garage?" I shot back, not letting him off the hook. He didn't respond, just stared at me like he was calculating what to do next. At this point, I was done talking. I turned around and went straight for the door, locking it behind me. I wasn't going to give him the chance to make another move. I immediately called the cops. While I waited, I kept my eyes on the garage through the window. I wasn't about to take my eyes off him. He stood there for a few minutes, just staring at the door. I wasn't sure if he was considering making a run for it or just trying to figure out his next move. But when the cops finally showed up, he was gone. The cops checked the area, the garage, and even the surrounding alley. Nothing. No forced entry, no stolen items. Everything was just as it was before, except for the fact that some guy had been hiding in my garage, waiting to do God knows what. They ran a quick check of the area, but found no one matching his description. It was like he just vanished. I won't lie, I felt unnerved for a while after that. I put up extra lights around the house, got a security system installed, and I make sure to check every corner of my property when I come home now. I don't know what that guy's endgame was, but I wasn't about to find out. The fact that he was just sitting there, waiting, hiding behind my stuff like he belonged there, that's what really got to me. So to the guy who thought he could make my garage his hiding spot, let's not meet again. You better hope we don't cross paths, because next time you won't get away so easily. I've learned to trust my instincts more since then. That smell, that feeling that something was off, I should have paid attention to it immediately. But I'm also glad I didn't back down. Sometimes you have to stand your ground, even when you're scared. The police suggested that the man might have been casing the neighborhood, using my garage as a temporary hiding spot while he watched other houses. They said it's not uncommon for burglars to use garages, sheds, or other outbuildings as observation points. That thought is almost worse than if he'd been targeting me specifically. The idea that he was using my property as a base of operations to potentially hurt my neighbors, that makes me feel responsible in a way. I've since talked to all my neighbors about what happened, and we've all upgraded our security. We have a neighborhood watch group now, and we all keep an eye on each other's properties. But I still check my garage every single night before going to bed. And I always trust that feeling when something doesn't seem right. Your instincts are there for a reason, and mine probably saved me from a much worse situation that night. The Crimson Forest. That name alone sent shivers down the spines of most stalkers, mixing superstitious dread with morbid curiosity. The heart of the exclusion zone. The final resting place of hundreds of acres of pine forest that had absorbed the first and most generous deadly release from the ruptured core of Reactor 3 at the Crimson Pine nuclear plant. Almost 30 years ago. A forest that died in an instant, turning a horrific rust-red color, then was reborn not in its former green glory, but in a nightmarish, twisted, radiation-soaked mockery of life. The trees here stood crooked, gnarled freaks. Their trunks were covered with growths and sores, while their sickly yellow and rusty needles and leaves gave off a faint, nauseating phosphorescent glow in the darkness. The silence in the Crimson Forest was absolute, almost physically pressing against the eardrums. Undisturbed by birdsong, they didn't nest here, or the chirping of insects. They had mutated into something else entirely. Only the relentless nervous clicking of the Geiger counter in hand, and the dry rustle of radioactive dust and dead pine needles under heavy combat boots. And the legends. Dark, terrifying legends whispered around dying campfires in safe zones by stalkers who had dared to venture to the edges of this cursed place and miraculously returned alive. Legends of headless mutants, dogs with burning eyes, wandering anomalies that tore people apart, shadows that stole souls and minds, strange beckoning lights and voices calling unwary travelers into the deepest thickets from which no one had ever returned. Mike knew all these legends by heart. He had heard them dozens of times during the 10 years he had spent in the zone. And still, He was walking here alone, into the very heart of the Crimson Forest. He was 35, an age when most of his former classmates and Marine buddies had already settled down with families, mortgages, beer bellies, and stable, but boring jobs in the outside world. Mike had chosen a different path. After the Marines, after several years of struggling in civilian life, he realized that his place was here, in the exclusion zone. He wasn't a typical stalker chasing expensive gear or artifacts to sell, though he didn't turn down such opportunities when they arose. He came to the zone for something else, that absolute, primordial silence that couldn't be found in the eternally humming, bustling world beyond the perimeter. For the intoxicating feeling of absolute freedom and simultaneous mortal danger that sharpened all his senses to the limit, forcing him to live here and now. For that unique, melancholic, post-apocalyptic beauty of nature dying, and simultaneously being reborn in monstrous forms. The zone was his drug, his only real passion, his religion, his only home that he knew and accepted with all its dangers and anomalies. He was an experienced lone stalker who knew the zone like the back of his hand well, at least those parts of it where you could still venture without a guaranteed ticket to the afterlife. He knew the safe paths and deadly traps. He could navigate around anomalies, the burners, the electrics, the jellies. He could read tracks on the ground and on dusty maps, feel danger with the back of his neck, survive for weeks in complete solitude where others would die in a couple of days. It wasn't that he didn't fear radiation. Everyone with a functioning brain feared it, but he had learned to live with it. His old, reliable military Geiger counter was always on guard, clicking and warning of dangerous zones. Lead plates sewn into his backpack lining, and a supply of rat-away pills of questionable effectiveness that supposedly helped remove radionuclides, or maybe just acted as a placebo, gave him a fragile illusion of protection. He feared something else, that invisible, inexplicable, irrational horror that permeated the very soil of the zone, especially here in the Crimson Forest. Something that couldn't be measured with a Geiger counter or predicted by anomaly maps. This was his third day of solo expedition, going deeper and deeper into the most forbidden, most toxic part of the Crimson Forest, where, by his calculations, no human foot had stepped, at least no living human for many, many years. The Geiger counter was clicking more insistently. Its crackling had turned into an almost continuous whine. The numbers on the dusty display showed readings that would make any rookie's hair stand on end and cause a veteran stalker's heart to clench with alarm. But Mike only frowned, checked his worn military map, and stubbornly pressed forward, pushing through dense thickets of mutated brush and stepping over fallen trunks of rusted trees. He had a specific goal: to find and possibly investigate one of the little-known, almost legendary anomalous zones marked on an old military survey map that he had acquired with great difficulty from a drunken retired sergeant. A zone marked on the map only with a conventional symbol and a brief, intriguing inscription. Object signal. What kind of object? What kind of signal? The map remained silent, but the name itself fired Mike's imagination. The forest around him was becoming increasingly strange, surreal, and unreal. Rusted, twisted pines and birches with peeling, cracked bark stood so densely that their dead, intertwined branches formed an almost impenetrable dome of light overhead. Here, in the heart of the crimson forest, eternal oppressive twilight reigned. Even on the clearest day, the ground squelched with viscous, rust-colored, oily-looking sludge mixed with rotting needles and remains of some unnaturally overgrown gelatinous mold or fungi that glowed faintly in the half-light with a dull, sickly greenish light. The Geiger counter crackled incessantly. Its whine had already merged into a monotonous, brain-drilling sound. Mike felt the familiar metallic taste in his mouth and a slight, growing dizziness, the first signs of serious radiation exposure. He hurriedly took several Radaway pills from his pocket, swallowing them without water. He understood that this was almost useless at such background levels, but the ritual was comforting. Can't stay here long, not long at all. This place is really cursed, just like they said, Mike thought, stopping for a short rest to catch his breath and take a sip of warm water from his military canteen. The Geiger counter was going crazy, the needle off the scale. Radiation levels so high that his reproductive system was probably already cooked. Another couple of hours of searching, and he'd have to get the hell out of here before it was too late. He was about to continue, when suddenly his attention was caught by some foreign object lying under the gnarled roots of one of the most hideous, twisted, rusty pines that had surfaced above ground. The object was clearly artificial, which in itself was a great rarity in this wild, impassable part of the zone. He approached closer, warily looking around. It was an old American military field radio, probably a PRC-25 or similar model from those that were incredibly popular in the 70s and 80s. Its olive drab plastic case was dirty and heavily scratched, but surprisingly intact, without visible cracks or holes. The telescopic antenna was broken at the base, but the radio itself looked as if it had been left here quite recently, not 30 years ago. Very strange. How did it get here? Who could have dragged it to such a remote place and abandoned it? Mike picked up the unexpected find with undisguised curiosity. The radio turned out to be quite heavy, substantial. He turned it over in his hands, brushed off the layer of red radioactive dust, and tried to open the battery compartment on the back. It was completely empty. Even the contacts inside had rusted. He turned the old frequency tuning knob. The scale moved with difficulty, sticking. He turned the volume and power knob. A click sounded, but nothing happened. Well, yeah, what did I expect? No batteries, just a piece of old plastic. And suddenly the radio unexpectedly came to life. From the round speaker, covered with a thick layer of dust and dirt, came a loud, deafening crackle of static. And then through the crackling broke a clear, distinct, and completely impossible signal in this radioactive hell. A female voice, monotonous, colorless, devoid of any emotion, almost mechanical. She began to speak measured words, as if reading from a script, pronouncing numbers. 597284136, 597284136. The numbers repeated again and again in the same hypnotic sequence. And beneath this monotonous, lifeless voice, sounding in the background, barely audible but distinct, blood-chillingly, came quiet, inconsolable, heartbreaking childish sobbing. The crying of a small child, hopeless, full of such grief, such fear, and such loneliness that something painfully trembled and clenched inside Mike. An old, cynical stalker hardened by the zone. He froze in place, thunderstruck, listening to this strange, terrible, impossible broadcast. His heart began to pound anxiously in his chest. What was this? A number station here in the very heart of the Crimson Forest. And with children's crying in the background, this couldn't be. And how was it working without batteries? He turned the radio over again and peered into the empty battery compartment. It was completely empty. Not even a hint of contacts remained. Everything had rotted away. The radio was working by itself, powered by some unknown energy source, picking up a strange, otherworldly signal from nowhere. He tried to turn the frequency tuning knob again. The signal immediately disappeared, replaced by the atmospheric crackling and hissing typical of these places, the background noise of the zone itself. He returned the knob to its previous position, and again the crystal-clear signal. The monotonous female voice reading the endless sequence of numbers, the quiet, soul-tearing children's crying beneath it. The signal was stable only on this one frequency. So this seems to be that very object signal, or part of it. Mike took out his old, reliable military compass and tried to determine the direction from which this strange signal was coming. Using the weak directionality of the radio's built-in antenna stub, he determined that the signal was steady, powerful, barely weakening. And it was coming exactly from the northeast, just where that same mysterious object signal was marked on his worn military map. Deeper into the Crimson Forest, into its most radioactive, anomalous, and deadly dangerous depths. A trap, the sensible thought flashed again. Self-preservation instinct screamed danger. Some cunning anomaly is generating this signal to lure curious idiots like me here, or someone or something is deliberately calling. But why? He had almost decided to throw away this cursed radio, get the hell out of here while he was still in one piece. But suddenly, the children's crying from the radio's speaker became louder, more desperate, more hopeless. It was so real, so alive, so full of genuine grief and loneliness, that something painfully trembled inside Mike. An old, seasoned, cynical stalker who had seen everything in the zone. It seemed to him, or was this crying painfully familiar, as if he had heard it once, long ago, in his own distant orphan childhood spent in a gray state orphanage? Or was it someone else crying? Someone from those few he had once known and lost in this world or in the zone itself? Nonsense, radiation hallucinations again, or it's specifically playing on my feelings. Yeah, appealing to pity. He took out his old, battle-tested radio and tried to contact the outside world or reach Wolf. Long hissing, crackling interference. Finally, through them, Wolf's familiar hoarse voice broke through with difficulty. "Barely hear you, Mike, is that you? What the hell are you still doing there? I told you to get out. Over." "Wolf, I hear you, thank God," Mike rejoiced, as if he had heard the voice of a guardian angel. "I'm still here in the Crimson Forest. I caught this strange signal." A woman's voice monotonously reading numbers, and underneath it, a child is crying to break your heart. The radio works without batteries. Do you happen to know what this could be? Maybe some cunning anomaly. Over. In the Crimson Forest. Are you completely crazy, Mike? Or do you think you're immortal? The radiation there is so high you'll start glowing in the dark within an hour. And that signal of yours. Yeah, I've heard about such things. Stories circulate among old stalkers. They say it's the voice zones or the siren's cry. That's what they call it. It calls to those who are lost, who are alone, who are searching for something they themselves don't know what. Those who follow this call never return. They go mad or disappear without a trace, or become part of this voice, part of the zone. Get out of there immediately, Mike. Do you hear me? Before it's too late. It's a trap, a deadly business. Over. A trap becoming part of the zone. Got it, Wolf. Thanks for the warning. End transmission. Mike turned off the radio. His hand trembled slightly. Any sensible stalker in his place would have turned around and run from here as fast as possible. He needed to leave right now, immediately. But the children's crying from the speaker of the old radio became even louder, even more desperate, even more soul-rending. It was so real, so alive, so full of genuine grief and defenseless loneliness that Mike simply couldn't ignore it. And he knew this crying was calling him, Mike specifically. He felt it quite distinctly with every cell of his body. Some inexplicable, irrational, but mighty force was pulling him there, to the northeast, into the most cursed heart of the crimson forest, to the source of this strange signal, to the invisible crying child. Curiosity killed the cat, and more than one overly curious stalker, the old saying, as old as the zone itself, flashed through his head again. But he had already made his decision. He would go. He had to go. He had to find out what or who was crying there in the depths of the dead radioactive forest. Maybe this was his chance. A chance to find something real, something important in this cursed, but so attractive zone. Or maybe this was his chance to finally and irrevocably perish in it, to become another legend, another whisper around a stalker's campfire. He didn't know, but he took a step, clutching the old, revived radio in one hand and his faithful worn Beretta pistol in the other. He stepped deeper into the red, phosphorescent, radiation-whispering thickets of the crimson forest, toward his fate, toward the unknown, toward the calling crying. The path deeper was slow, agonizing, and surreal. Mike had been walking for several long hours, guided by the compass needle pointing northeast, and by the signal strength in the old radio he carried in his hand like some mystical artifact. The signal was getting louder, clearer, almost undrowned now by the zone's background crackling. The monotonous, lifeless female voice tirelessly repeated its strange sequence of numbers like a wound-up mechanism. 597284136, 597284136. And beneath it, the invisible child cried just as heart-rendingly, inconsolably, and almost physically tangibly. This incessant children's crying affected his nerves worse than radiation. It caused a dull, gnawing melancholy in his chest, and an inexplicable irrational anxiety bordering on panic. The forest around him was becoming increasingly strange, alien, hostile. Rusty, twisted, radiation-deformed pines and birches with peeling, cracked bark stood so densely that their dead, intertwined branches formed an almost impenetrable rust-green dome overhead. Here, in the heart of the crimson forest, eternal oppressive twilight reigned. Even in rare moments when the sun tried to break through the leaden clouds, the ground squelched with viscous, rust-colored, oily-looking sludge mixed with rotting needles, dead leaves, and remains of some unnaturally overgrown gelatinous, pulsating mold or fungi that glowed faintly in the half-light with a dull, sickly greenish or bluish phosphorescent light. The Geiger counter in Mike's hand crackled incessantly. Its whine had already merged into one monotonous, high, brain-drilling sound. The numbers on the dusty display were off the scale, showing radiation levels absolutely incompatible with life. Mike felt the familiar, unpleasant metallic taste in his mouth. slight nausea, and growing dizziness, clear signs of serious radiation exposure. Again and again, he swallowed useless rat-away pills from his first aid kit, understanding that this was nothing more than self-deception. Here, in this place, one couldn't stay long. Every minute brought him closer to the invisible line beyond which irreversible cell decay and slow, agonizing death began. But the signal beckoned him forward like a light beckons a lost traveler in a swamp. And the crying, this endless, soul-rending children's crying, had become somehow unbearable, directed specifically at him, Mike. Now it seemed to him that he heard in this crying not only echoes of his own lonely orphanage childhood, but also the voices of those he had once known and lost in his troubled life. His mother's voice, which he barely remembered. The voice of his first love, Jessica, who had died in an accident partly because of him many years ago. The voice of an unborn child he had once secretly dreamed of, but who was never destined to be born. The signal wasn't just calling him. It was playing on his deepest, most hidden heartstrings, on his fears, his guilt, his unspoken regrets. This isn't just a signal. This is something intelligent, very ancient, and very evil. It's rummaging through my head. It's reading my thoughts, my memories, using them against me, Mike thought with horror and disgust. Or I'm just finally going mad from radiation, loneliness, and this cursed crying. The zone around him also began to change, as if reacting to his presence or his approach to the signal source. The air became even denser, heavier, almost viscous. Breathing became more difficult. Every breath echoed with pain in his lungs. The silence became even more oppressive, absolute, but now it constantly contained some strange, otherworldly sounds. A quiet, creeping rustle unlike the rustle of leaves or wind. Dull, rhythmic beats coming as if from under the very earth. A distant, prolonged, inhuman howl that chilled the blood and made the hair on his head stand on end. Sometimes he thought he saw rapid movement between the ugly tree trunks out of the corner of his eye. Either dark, shapeless shadows flashed and disappeared, or some quick, mutated animals were watching him from ambush. Or maybe these were just hallucinations born of radiation and fear. He was no longer sure of anything. He tried again to contact Wolf, just to hear a living human voice, but in response heard only deafening hissing and crackling interference. Communication here, in the heart of the Crimson Forest, near Object Signal, didn't work at all. He was alone, one-on-one with the hostile zone, and with that unknown, terrible something that was inexorably calling him to itself. He took out his old field notebook and pencil stub, and began recording the sequence of numbers that the mechanical female voice from the radio still repeated monotonously, without expression. 597284136. Again and again, endlessly. What could this mean? Coordinates of some secret bunker, access code, or just a random set of numbers designed to drive anyone who tried to find meaning in them mad. He tried to apply known encryption keys, military codes, mathematical sequences to them, but all in vain. The numbers seemed like a completely meaningless, chaotic set, but the voice repeated them with such mechanical, hypnotic insistence, as if it were a message of incredible universal importance. The key to solving the mystery of the zone itself, or the key to his own destruction. At some point, pushing through particularly dense thickets of rusty, thorny brush, Mike stumbled upon another strange, find completely out of place here. Among the crooked, radiation-deformed trees, he saw a small clearing, and on it several rusted, tilted playground swings and an old wooden sandbox with peeling blue paint. The remains of an old playground, inexplicably found in this dead, radioactive wilderness. Maybe there used to be some secret settlement or military town here that was erased from all maps. The swings in the clearing slowly creaked back and forth by themselves, though there was no wind at all. And in the sandbox, someone was sitting. A small figure in a white, dirty dress sat with her back to him, silently sifting the red radioactive sand with an old plastic shovel. Mike's heart stopped from a mixture of horror and bewilderment. A child here, alone, in the center of the crimson forest. This couldn't be. Slowly trying not to make noise, afraid to frighten the vision or whatever was hiding behind it, he approached the sandbox. "Little girl, hey, how did you get here? Are you lost?" he called quietly. His voice trembled. The figure in the sandbox froze for a moment, then slowly, very slowly, began to turn toward him. And Mike saw her face empty, absolutely pale, smooth as porcelain, without eyes, without nose, without mouth. Just a perfectly smooth white mask. But the crying, that same soul-rending, heart-breaking children's crying, now came directly from this empty, faceless mask. Mike recoiled in horror, nearly falling. The figure slowly rose to its thin legs, dropping the shovel into the radioactive sand. It reached out its small hands toward him, as if asking for help or an embrace. And then its body began to melt, blur like a wax figure in the sun, turning into a column of black, acrid smoke that quickly rose upward and dispersed in the motionless air without a trace. Only the crying remained. It now sounded from everywhere, from every rusty tree, from underground, from his own cursed radio. Hallucination. Strong, very strong. "Damn it," Mike muttered, wiping cold sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. "It's playing with me. It sees my fears, my weaknesses. It's trying to drive me mad before devouring me." The signal from the radio in his hand became even louder, almost deafening, unbearable. The monotonous female voice repeated its sequence of numbers without pause, and the child's crying had turned into a true, unceasing howl that made him want to cover his ears and run without looking back, wherever his eyes might lead. The Geiger counter was off the scale. Its crackling now merged with the voice from the radio into one continuous hellish cacophony of sounds. Mike realized he was very close to the signal source, to the heart of the anomaly, to that unknown thing that so insistently called him here, to this cursed place. The forest in front of him suddenly parted as if on command, and he emerged into a large, perfectly circular clearing, completely unlike the previous one with the playground. This was different. The ground here was completely burned, covered with a thick layer of wet, fine ash like dust. The trees around the clearing's edge stood black, charred, dead, like skeletons of prehistoric monsters. The air here was motionless and heavy. It smelled of burned metal and something else, unfamiliar and alarming. And in the very center of this dead clearing rose it. In the center of the burned ashen clearing, like a black spire reaching into the gloomy, leaden radioactive sky of the zone, stood it, the tower. But not just a tower, rather a monstrous construction reminiscent simultaneously of old, rusted emergency broadcast towers, a crooked power line support, and most of all, a giant civil defense siren from the Cold War era, installed here to warn of nuclear threat and forgotten forever. But there was something deeply wrong about this structure, alien, disgusting, nauseatingly alive. The tower itself, about 40 to 50 feet high, wasn't perfectly straight and metallic. It curved slightly, unnaturally, like the trunk of a giant, diseased, gnarled tree. Its surface was covered not just with rust, but with something revolting, resembling coagulated, cracked blood, old dirt, scraps of rotting flesh, and organic slime of dark brown, almost black color. At the base, the tower didn't simply stand on the ground. It seemed to grow into it, spreading out in several thick, gnarled, root-like offshoots, resembling either giant plant roots or monstrous tentacle-like appendages that went deep into the gray ashen soil and seemed to pulse barely perceptibly in some inhuman rhythm. At the tower's top, where a siren should have had a rotating mechanism or grill, was something completely unimaginable and nightmarish. Several huge, asymmetrically placed horn-like speakers of different sizes, resembling gramophone horns or mutated funnels. But looking more closely, Mike realized with horror that they weren't made of metal, they were organic. Dense, gray-pink, gelatinous, glistening with slime tissue, resembling inside-out flesh or giant throats of unknown blind creatures. These throats slowly, barely noticeably moved, trembled, rhythmically contracted, spewing from their dark, wet depths that same monotonous female voice reading numbers, and the soul-rending, mind-breaking children's crying. The signal now sounded deafeningly loud. It struck his ears, nerves, his very brain, filling all the space around. Inside these disgusting horns, something dark, wet, constantly oscillating could be seen, like tongues or vocal cords. From the tower, thick, braided rope-like cables or wires hung down to the base. But this, too, was an optical illusion. Looking closer through the veil of fear and radiation stupor, Mike realized these weren't cables. These were thick, swollen, strongly pulsating, bright crimson veins or giant tendons through which some dark, thick fluid slowly flowed. They snaked along the tower's surface and went underground to its roots. Tower Screamer, Mike mentally christened this unimaginable biochemical or purely organic spawn of the zone's sick fantasy. A creature masquerading as a human creation, but being something far more ancient, alien, and deadly dangerous. The old American military radio in Mike's hand was literally being torn apart by the incredible signal strength. The voice and crying beat against his ears with such force that they caused physical pain, nausea, and dizziness. The Geiger counter in his other hand screamed with a continuous shriek. The radiation here was simply off the charts lethal. Mike stood at the clearing's edge, mesmerized and simultaneously paralyzed by primal horror at the sight of this impossible, monstrous creature. He understood everything. The radio had been just bait, a retransmitter, a trap, possibly deliberately left here by the screamer's previous victim. The real signal source was here, before him. This terrible living construction, broadcasting its deadly call throughout the area. A call that he, like the last idiot, had followed, ignoring all warnings and self-preservation instincts. What now? Run. Where? Around him was the very center of the crimson forest, lethal radiation levels, anomalies, and possibly other zone spawns. And would this creature let him go now? Try to destroy the screamer. But how? Shoot with a pistol, like a pellet against an elephant, blow it up. He had no grenades or explosives with him. Only one thing remained: try to quietly leave before it noticed him and drew its attention. But it was too late. While he was feverishly going through options in his head, the screamer seemed to finally notice his presence. The monotonous reading of numbers and soul-rending crying suddenly stopped. An oppressive, crushing silence fell, broken only by his Geiger counter's screaming and the thunderous beating of his own heart in his chest. The speaker throats at the tower's top stopped moving, froze for a moment, then slowly, synchronously, all at once turned in his direction, like giant blind eyes. In their dark, wet depths, red lights flashed and burned brightly. Hundreds of small, malicious red eyes staring directly at him, into his very soul. The screamer spoke, rather, it didn't speak, it roared. This wasn't just sound, however loud it might be. This was a wave of pure, concentrated pain, horror, and madness that struck his brain with the force of a battering ram. A low-frequency, infrasonic roar that couldn't be heard with ears, but was felt by the whole body. It made bones vibrate, the ground under his feet tremble, his vision darken, and his insides clench into one icy, painful lump. Simultaneously with this inaudible roar, a murky, chaotic stream of mental images torn from his own memory and from the zone's collective unconscious crashed down on his consciousness. His worst fears, most painful childhood and youth memories, pictures of the nuclear disaster itself, radiation-mutilated bodies of people and animals, soundless screams of those dying in fire and agony. Reality around him began to swim, distort, ripple. The rusty trees behind him began to bend, melt like wax candles, the ground slipping from under his feet, turning into viscous quicksand. "No, stop, shut up," Mike screamed in an inhuman voice, covering his ears with his hands, trying to somehow protect himself from this unbearable sonic and mental assault. He fell to his knees on the gray ash, losing orientation in space and time. The screamer continued its soundless but deadly attack. Its horn throats at the tower's top vibrated, spewing ever new waves of pure horror and madness. Mike felt his consciousness beginning to slowly disintegrate, his will breaking, crumbling under this inhuman onslaught. He saw thick, white worm-like or python-like roots and offshoots crawling toward him from the tower's base, tearing through the ashen soil, slowly, inexorably creeping toward him across the burned ground. "No, I won't give up. I won't become part of this thing." With a last desperate effort of will, he forced himself to raise his head, overcoming nausea and weakness. He had to do something, anything. His clouded gaze accidentally fell on the broken radio he had dropped beside him. When he fell to his knees, the radio had shattered, but its speaker, from the speaker's fragments still came that same deafening, inaudible roar as from the screamer itself. It's retransmitting, it's connected to it. This is its anchor, its weak point. Mike, swaying, crawled toward the radio fragments, grabbed the largest piece with the speaker circuit, and gathering the last remnants of willpower, hurled it back toward the screamer, aiming for one of its vibrating horns. The radio fragment described an arc, struck the edge of one of the throats, and bounced off. It seemed like a completely useless gesture, but the screamer suddenly fell silent. Its infrasonic attack abruptly stopped. The red lights in its horns flickered convulsively and dimmed. It made a strange, gurgling, surprised, or even frightened sound. Did it work? Could this old radio have been not just bait, but some important part of it, or its Achilles heel? Mike, taking advantage of the unexpected respite, jumped to his feet. He needed to run, immediately run from here as fast as possible. But the screamer wasn't going to let him go so easily. It seemed to quickly recover from its momentary confusion and fly into an indescribable rage. Its roots and offshoots from the base rushed toward Mike with doubled speed, raising clouds of ash. From the horns at the tower's top poured sound again, this time not a soundless roar, but a deafening, physically tangible high-frequency screech that threatened to burst his eardrums and skull. This screech was so full of hatred, such malice, that Mike understood it wouldn't let him leave alive. He screamed in pain, covering his ears, but the screech sounded directly in his head, tearing his brain apart. He stumbled over some debris on the ground and fell. The root offshoots were very close now. They writhed above him, reaching for him with their blind, pulsating ends to grab, entangle, drag him underground to their lair. That's it, this is definitely the end. Sorry, Zone, sorry, Wolf. A last desperate thought flashed. He closed his eyes, expecting the inevitable end. But instead of the icy, suffocating touch of roots, he heard the familiar click of a safety catch, then the deafening roar of an explosion very close by. He jerked his eyes open. The sky above the clearing was lit by a bright flash. The tower screamer stood entirely engulfed in flame and black smoke. One of its thick roots reaching directly toward Mike had been torn off by the explosion and now writhed and twisted on the ground like a severed snake. What happened? Mike raised his head with difficulty. At the clearing's edge, at the very border of the dead forest, stood a figure in an old, worn stalker suit and gas mask. In his hands, he held a smoking, disposable rocket launcher. Wolf, what the hell? I told you to get out of there, you stubborn idiot. The familiar voice of Wolf growled through the gas mask speaker. Almost too late. Your brain completely shut down if you climbed into this hell. Come on, get your skinny ass up before this thing recovers and calls for backup. The screamer was indeed already recovering. The flames on it quickly died out, as if the monster's own flesh was consuming them. It made a furious, gurgling, bubbling roar. Its surviving horn throats turned toward Wolf, and their red lights burned with hellish fire. Shoot at the heads, at those horns. Maybe we can shut it up for good, Mike shouted, raising his useless pistol and opening fire at the tower's top. Mike's pistol bullets just bounced harmlessly off the dense organic tissue of the horns and stuck in them without visible effect. But Wolf's second rocket launcher charge hit its target. The rocket struck directly into the cluster of horns at the tower's top. A deafening explosion rang out. Several of the largest throats exploded into bloody, smoking pieces, showering the entire clearing with a fountain of dark, stinking sludge and shreds of gray-pink flesh. The screamer howled so terribly, so piercingly, that the very earth beneath their feet trembled. Its tower-like body swayed frantically from side to side. It began to slowly, with deafening creaking and grinding, lean toward the ground, pulling its gigantic pulsating roots from the soil. With a final death roar, it crashed onto the burned earth of the clearing, raising a huge cloud of ash and radioactive dust. The red lights in its remaining mutilated horns flickered convulsively several times and finally went out. It fell silent forever. Mike and Wolf stood in the middle of the clearing, deafened, breathing heavily, staring at the enormous, fallen, smoking body of the monstrous tower screamer. "Is it dead?" Mike asked, still not believing what had happened. Hell knows, I'd like to believe so, Wolf replied hoarsely, reloading his rocket launcher just in case. With this damn zone, you can never be completely sure. But we'd better get out of here fast before someone or something else shows up from all this noise and stench. They hurried away from the terrible clearing without speaking, leaving behind the smoking, fallen body of the tower screamer, one of the most horrible secrets of the Crimson Forest. They walked silently, supporting each other, making their way out of the dead radioactive wilderness, back to the relative safety of the perimeter. Hours later, as they finally reached the zone's edge where Wolf had set up a temporary camp, Mike turned back one last time toward the dark silhouette of the Crimson Forest on the horizon. The strange signal no longer called to him. The children's crying had fallen silent. The tower screamer was dead. Its terrible broadcast ended forever. But Mike knew that the zone held many more secrets, many more horrors waiting in its depths. And despite everything he had been through, despite the radiation poisoning that would take weeks to recover from, despite the nightmares that would haunt him for months to come, he knew he would return. The zone had claimed him long ago, had become part of his soul, just as he had become part of it. "You know what, Wolf?" Mike said quietly, accepting a bottle of clean water and Radaway pills from his friend. "Next time you tell me to stay away from something, I think I'll actually listen." Wolf laughed grimly, removing his gas mask to reveal a weathered face marked by years in the zone. "Sure you will, Mike. Sure you will. That's what they all say. Until the next signal calls, until the next mystery presents itself. The zone doesn't let go of people like us. It just gives us time to recover before it pulls us back in." Mike nodded, knowing Wolf was right. As he looked back toward the Crimson Forest one more time, he could swear he saw a faint red glow on the horizon, barely visible against the darkening sky. Somewhere in those twisted, radiation-soaked depths, other secrets waited. Other voices called out in the darkness, seeking lost souls to join their eternal song. But for now, the tower screamer's voice had been silenced, and that was enough. The zone would have to wait for another day, another signal, another fool brave enough or stupid enough to follow where it led. Mike closed his eyes and tried to push away the memory of that terrible, beautiful, haunting children's cry that had almost cost him everything. The zone never truly let anyone go. It just waited patiently for their return. November in Oregon had always been gray, but this year felt different. The rain didn't just fall, it clung to everything like a damp shroud, seeping through Margaret Coleman's wool coat, through her graying hair, through her very bones. At 63, Maggie had grown accustomed to the Pacific Northwest's moods, but this autumn seemed particularly cruel, as if the sky itself was mourning. She pulled her late husband's old cashmere scarf tighter around her neck, the only remnant of David she still wore, and made her way through the weekend flea market sprawled across the parking lot of the abandoned Westfield Mall. The massive concrete structure loomed behind the vendors like a tombstone, its broken windows and peeling paint a testament to better days long past. Maggie's rubber boots squelched through puddles that reflected the gray sky, mixing with fallen leaves and scattered trash, candy wrappers, cigarette butts, and the occasional torn lottery ticket. She needed soil, good rich soil for her violets, which had been acting strange lately, refusing to bloom and dropping their leaves despite her careful attention. Her flowers were her sanctuary, her quiet harbor in the ocean of loneliness that had crashed over her since David's sudden heart attack 2 years ago. Their son Michael lived in Tokyo now, building his life on the other side of the world, and the silence in her small apartment had become deafening. The market buzzed with its usual weekend energy. Weathered women hawked wilted vegetables from card tables, their faces lined with decades of disappointment. Men in stained jackets promised honey of questionable origin, while clusters of elderly folks sold everything from hand-knitted socks to jars of pickled vegetables. Maggie walked past them without really seeing, her eyes scanning for the familiar face of Mrs. Patterson, who always had the best potting soil. But something made her pause, something she'd never noticed before. A narrow gap between two canvas-covered booths selling cheap plastic housewares and colorful polyester clothing. She'd been coming to this market for years, every Saturday morning like clockwork, but this little alcove had somehow escaped her notice. Or perhaps she'd simply been too focused, too hurried to pay attention. Today, though, curiosity, that rare visitor in her ordered life, drew her toward the shadowy space. Under a tarp that reeked of mildew and age sat a woman, though calling her a woman felt inadequate. She seemed ancient, timeless, as if the years had forgotten her entirely. Her face was a map of deep lines and shadows, skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Her eyes, clouded and pale, stared through Maggie into some distant place only she could see. Before her, on a stained burlap cloth, sat several clay pots with half-dead geraniums, and one plant that made Maggie's breath catch in her throat. It stood apart from the others, almost seeming to disdain its shabby companions. The flower was impossible, magnificent, its bloom nearly the size of a dinner plate, colored the deepest blue-black Maggie had ever seen, like velvet cut from midnight itself. The petals were thick and heavy, curving in asymmetrical patterns that seemed both beautiful and somehow predatory, like the mouth of some exotic creature. Fine veins of dull gold threaded through the dark surface, pulsing with a subtle inner light even in the dim space. It was unlike any plant she'd ever seen in her many gardening catalogs, or at the botanical gardens she used to visit with David. A scent drifted from it, barely perceptible but intoxicating, sweet and narcotic with hints of spice, and something else. Something that made her heart race and her head feel light. "What kind of flower is this?" Maggie's voice came out rough, surprised by her own boldness. The old woman slowly turned her head, her milky eyes reluctantly focusing on Maggie. When their gazes met, Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "Special one," the woman croaked, her voice like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "For a special home, not for everyone, it chooses." Maggie stepped closer, feeling an almost physical pull toward the strange bloom. It was like being hypnotized, mesmerized by something beyond her understanding. She reached out, her fingertips almost touching the cool-looking velvet petals. "Don't touch," the woman snapped suddenly. "It will choose when it's ready. It knows souls." Maggie pulled her hand back as if burned. Souls. What kind of soul did she have? Gray as this November day, quiet as her empty apartment. "How much?" she asked, her voice steadier now. She already knew she wouldn't leave without it, whatever the cost. It was like a missing piece of her life's puzzle, promising color and mystery and meaning. The woman stared past her again, seeming to lose interest. "Take it," she whispered. "It's dying here. suffocating. You pay what you think it's worth or don't pay at all. It needs a home, your home. It chose you. This was strange, too strange even for this ramshackle market. Such a flower should cost a fortune, but the woman was practically giving it away. Yet something about it called to her, promised the quiet joy she'd been searching for and almost despaired of finding. Maggie fumbled in her purse, pulling out her wallet. Money was tight, pension only went so far, but she pulled out several crumpled bills, everything she had for groceries, and held them toward the woman. The old woman didn't even look at the money, just nodded toward the plant. Take it, care for it. It likes attention and quiet. Maggie carefully lifted the heavy clay pot with both hands. It was unexpectedly warm, as if heated from within, and the soil was dark, almost black, and very damp, smelling of forest floor after rain and something else. Something metallic and strange. She wanted to ask the woman about the plant's name, how to care for it. But when she looked up, the old woman had already withdrawn into her indifference. Eyes half closed, as if dozing or perhaps dead, with her eyes open. Shivering with a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Maggie hurried away from the uncomfortable alcove back to the noisy, messy, but reassuringly normal market. As she reached her car, she turned back to look at the spot where she'd found the plant. The space between the booths was empty. No woman, no tarp, no dying geraniums, just a blank wall and some garbage cans. Maggie shook her head. She must have walked further than she thought, gotten turned around in the maze of vendors. At home, she gave the new plant the place of honor on the old oak table by the living room window, where the afternoon sun sometimes broke through the clouds. Her other plants, 24 pots of violets in various stages of bloom, a couple of temperamental orchids, a modest spider plant, and a proud rubber tree that David had given her, suddenly seemed pale and insignificant compared to this blue-black velvet miracle. "Hello, beautiful," she whispered, gently touching one of the firm, cool leaves. The leaf seemed to tremble under her touch, or perhaps she imagined it. "I'm Maggie. You're going to live with me now. I'll take good care of you." The plant seemed to respond, its sweet scent growing stronger, floating through the room and wrapping around her like an invisible warm embrace. For the first time in months since David's funeral, she felt not just relief or momentary distraction, but genuine euphoria, a lightness in her whole body, an inexplicable surge of energy, a quiet, bright joy that filled the emptiness in her chest. She spent the entire evening with the plant, forgetting about the soil she'd meant to buy for her violets. She watered it with room temperature water and wiped each leaf with a soft, damp cloth, whispering nonsense endearments and compliments like she would to a child. She forgot about dinner, about the evening news, about her promise to call her sister Linda in Portland. All of that seemed petty and unnecessary compared to the miracle now living in her home. The next few days passed in a happy but strange haze. Maggie woke thinking about the plant and fell asleep under its increasingly strong fragrance. The euphoria didn't fade. If anything, it grew deeper, steadier, transforming into a quiet, all-consuming obsession. She talked to it for hours, sharing her simple daily news, complaining about the weather, telling it about dreams that had become surprisingly vivid and peaceful. The plant seemed to listen, gently swaying its dark, heavy bloom, and its scent had become so dense it was almost physical, sweet and pleasant and thick. With that same troubling narcotic note that no longer frightened, but attracted her even more, promising peace and oblivion. Work at the small accounting firm where she'd been employed for over 20 years took a back seat. She sat at her desk surrounded by files, turned on her computer, and dove into the world of numbers and reports, but did everything mechanically, automatically. Her thoughts constantly drifted home to her dark velvet treasure. Her colleagues, two women about her age, Janet and Susan, noticed her distraction, her detachment, the strange wandering smile that sometimes crossed her usually serious face. "Maggie, what's with you today?" Janet asked one afternoon, stopping by her cubicle with a cup of coffee. "You seem different. Did you meet someone?" Maggie, startled, pulled from her reverie. "What? No, Janet. I'm just in a good mood. The weather's been nice." "Nice?" Janet looked out the window at the driving rain. "Honey, it's been pouring for 3 days straight. Maybe you should see a doctor. You look flushed, and your eyes seem a little glassy." Maggie just smiled vaguely and turned back to her computer screen, where numbers danced before her eyes, forming strange patterns like the golden veins on dark petals. Every evening, returning home and rushing to her beloved plant, Maggie would glance at the windowsill where her violets sat. What she saw made her frown with annoyance. The leaves of her former favorites, always lush and velvety green, had yellowed and shriveled, covered with ugly brown spots, and a grayish film that looked like mold or spider webs. The soil in their pots was dry and cracked, though she was almost certain she'd watered them yesterday or the day before. Her memory had been unreliable lately. "Oh, you little prima donnas," she muttered without much concern, hastily splashing water from the watering can. "So ungrateful for all my care." But a warning bell did ring somewhere in the back of her mind. She went to check on her rubber tree. Its glossy leaves also looked lifeless, some curled and blackened at the edges as if burned. The spider plant, usually so hardy, had simply dried up, turning into a brown broom. Even the orchids, survivors of many trials, looked sick. "Must be a draft," Maggie thought, checking the window latch, though outside it was nearly windless. "Or bad soil from last time." She gratefully seized on this thought and returned to her dark flower. It looked magnificent. The bloom had grown even larger, heavier, its petals unfurling wider to show the dark, almost black interior, while the golden veins pulsed brighter, as if liquid energy flowed through them. The scent enveloped her like a thick shawl, driving away unpleasant thoughts about the dying plants. What did it matter if the other plants withered? They were just plants, but this one was something more. It was alive, it understood her, it gave her joy. It was the most important thing in her life. The doorbell rang, insistent and demanding. Maggie grimaced. Who could it be at this awkward hour? Probably Dorothy Mills from the second floor again, always complaining about something. She reluctantly shuffled to the front door, trying to walk quietly so as not to disturb her blissful state. On the threshold stood her neighbor, Dorothy Mills, a heavy woman in her 70s, with perpetually pursed lips and narrow, close-set eyes. Her face was red with anger. "Margaret, hello," she began without preamble as soon as Maggie cracked the door open. Her voice rang with indignation. "Do you have any conscience? There's some strange smell coming from your apartment, been going on for 4 days now. Sweet, cloying makes my head spin. I can't breathe. My grandson Tommy is visiting, and he's been listless, sleeping all the time. Are you spraying for bugs, or maybe you've got some industrial strength air freshener?" Maggie blinked in surprise, trying to collect her thoughts through the sweet haze in her head. Smell. No, I'm not spraying anything, Dorothy. Maybe it's coming from someone else's apartment. No, it's definitely from yours. I checked the whole building. It's strongest right here at your door. You need to do something about it. I'm thinking of calling the health department. Okay, I'll look into it, Maggie said hastily, wanting nothing more than for her neighbor to leave and stop disrupting the harmony of her world. Maybe it's an old air freshener. I'll throw it out right away. She almost forcefully closed the door in Dorothy's still outraged face and leaned against it, breathing heavily. Rude, argumentative woman. She didn't understand beauty. The scent meant his scent, her plant's scent, was so strong it filled not just her apartment, but seeped out to the neighbors. The thought didn't frighten her, but caused a strange, spiteful sense of pride. Let them feel it, let them envy her. Her plant, her special plant, was sharing its power, its beauty with the whole world, or at least the whole building. Soon they would all understand. She returned to the living room. The scent seemed even thicker, sweeter. It pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Maggie breathed in deeply with pleasure, feeling euphoria wash over her again, sweeping away the remnants of anxiety and irritation from her neighbor's visit. She approached the plant and gently stroked its dark velvet petal. "They like you too, my dear," she whispered, smiling. "They just don't understand yet, but they will. Soon everyone will love you and everything will be quiet and good." She ran her finger along a golden vein, and it seemed to her that she felt a weak answering vibration under her finger. A week passed, or maybe 2, possibly a month. Maggie had lost track of time. The calendar on the wall still showed November, but outside the window, snow might have been falling, or brown leaves might still be dropping. She didn't know and didn't want to know. Her world had finally narrowed to the size of her small apartment, and at the center of that world was her blue-black flower, which she now simply called mine or beautiful. Names seemed unnecessary, excessive. He was simply him. Days and nights blended into one continuous, viscous cycle. Sleep without dreams, or conversely, filled with bright pulsing visions of dark velvet gardens and golden rivers. Awakening to the thick narcotic scent that no longer aired out even when she opened a window. Long hours spent motionless beside him, in the armchair or simply on the floor. Short automatic actions, washing with cold water, drinking a cup of cold tea, returning to him, and sleep again, deep and viscous as swamp mud. She almost stopped eating. A piece of bread, an apple, that was all her food for the day. She didn't feel hungry. Her body had become light, almost weightless. Her bones protruded under thin skin, but she felt no weakness as long as she was near him. He fed her with his scent, his presence, his quiet, mighty power. However, when she had to go to the front door to collect another batch of unwanted newspapers and advertising flyers from the mailbox, or take out a bag of garbage, which happened less and less often, terrible nausea, weakness, and dizziness would overwhelm her. The world would start spinning, and the sounds of the outside world, the squeak of the elevator, dogs barking in the yard, children's shouts, seemed deafening and hostile. So she tried not to leave the apartment at all. The phone rang less and less. Her sister Linda in Portland first worried, then took offense at the monosyllabic, meaningless answers and stopped calling. Janet and Susan from work called a couple of times, asking why she wasn't coming in, whether she was sick. Maggie mumbled something incoherent about the flu, about weakness, about taking sick leave soon. Her voice had become quiet, muffled, monotonous, as if she were speaking from under a thick layer of cotton. No one called her anymore, and she didn't need them to. She had him. Her other plants died completely. Shriveled, blackened, dried-up mummies still stood on the windowsills and shelves, covered with a thick layer of dust and strange grayish mold that looked like spider webs or cotton. Maggie walked past them without noticing their pitiful appearance. Sometimes she would mechanically brush dust off them, and then the dry leaves and stems would crumble to ash. Her eyes saw only him. He had grown incredibly, luxuriously, filling almost the entire table by the window and already hanging his heavy leaves and shoots onto the floor. He had become a giant. His thick, almost woody stem was covered with dark, glossy bark, and the blue-black buds bloomed one after another, exuding an increasingly dense, all-penetrating aroma. At his base, in the dark and eternally moist soil, dozens of tiny green bumps appeared, new shoots, his children. The scent had become the absolute master of the apartment. It no longer seemed like just a smell. It was a dense, almost tangible substance hanging in the air, a misty golden haze. It had soaked into the old furniture, the heavy curtains, the clothes in the closets, her hair and skin. It seeped under the front door in a dense, sweet stream, filled the cracks in the window frames, crawled through the ventilation shafts up and down, slowly but surely saturating the entire building. The neighbors first complained. Dorothy Mills knocked on the door several more times, shouting and threatening police and court. Her voice became increasingly hysterical, but then strange plaintive notes appeared in it, as if she were fighting not only with Maggie but with herself, with incomprehensible weakness that had gripped her. Frank Rodriguez from the third floor, a former military man, a direct and decisive person, once even tried to call the local police. Maggie heard his loud, indignant voice on the stairs, but the officer, a young lieutenant, just waved him off, advised him to file a complaint, and left. Frank cursed on the landing for a long time, threatening to disperse everyone here, but his voice no longer sounded so confident. Amy Walsh, a young mother from the second floor, caught Maggie several times at the mailboxes. Her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes. "Margaret," she whispered confusedly, "I don't know what to do. My son Tyler has become completely lethargic. He sleeps all the time, barely eats, doesn't smile. I called the doctor, but he says it's just a vitamin deficiency. It'll pass. But I'm scared. And this smell of yours, it's everywhere. Maybe it's really something harmful." Maggie looked at her with an absent gaze, smiling gently. "Don't worry, Amy," she replied in her new quiet voice. "Everything will be fine. It's just a fragrance, a healing one. It calms, gives peace. Don't you feel it?" Sometimes, under the influence of his all-penetrating presence, Maggie felt a strange, almost maternal desire to share his beauty, his peace with others. Once, meeting Amy at the mailbox, Amy looked completely exhausted, swaying from weakness. Maggie suddenly, decisively took her by the hand and pressed a small clay pot into it, which she had prepared in advance. "Take this, Amy," she whispered conspiratorially, her eyes feverishly but joyfully shining. "This is a cutting from my beautiful one. Look what a darling, small but already strong. He'll like it at your place. Put him in the light, water him, and talk to him. He loves attention. He'll help your boy calm him down." In the pot was one of those tiny shoots that had appeared at the base of the mother plant. It had already sprouted, with a thin but strong dark stem, with two tiny velvety blue-black leaves, with barely visible golden sparkles. Amy wanted to refuse, instinctively recoiling from the pot, frightened by Maggie's strange, feverish appearance, pale and gaunt with huge, dark, burning pupils. But something in her insistent, persuasive whisper and the hypnotic, unearthly beauty of the miniature shoot made her take the pot. Her hands trembled. "Thank you, Margaret," she said uncertainly, not looking at Maggie. "He's very beautiful." "He's special," Maggie smiled with her new frightening blissful smile. "Take care of him and everything will be fine. Quiet will come peace." After this conversation, the talk on the stairs stopped completely. First, Dorothy Mills stopped knocking and shouting. Her door no longer opened. Then Frank Rodriguez fell silent. A neighbor living with him on the same floor told the policeman, who finally came on the old complaint, that the old man hadn't been seen or heard for several days. But the door was locked from the inside. The officer shrugged and left. Amy no longer came out for walks with the stroller and no longer met Maggie at the mailboxes. The building plunged into unnatural, oppressive, viscous silence. No working televisions or radios were heard in the evenings. No usual children's crying or laughter. No family quarrels. No slamming doors. Only sometimes, if you listened carefully while standing on the landing, you could catch from behind some doors quiet, monotonous, indistinct murmuring, similar to neither prayer nor lullaby nor incoherent delirium, and another quiet, barely audible rustle, as if wind walked through thick foliage inside the apartments, but there was no wind. The mail carrier, Rita, a grim woman of pre-retirement age, first just grumbled, trying to stuff more newspapers and bills into the overflowing mailboxes of apartments on the second through third floors. Then she began to worry. She knew many of the residents personally, knew that Dorothy Mills rarely left home, but always paid her bills on time, knew that Frank Rodriguez went for milk every morning, knew that Amy walked with her child twice a day. Now none of them were visible. Rita knocked on the doors several times, long and insistently. Behind the doors was dead silence, and only a weak, cloying, sweet, suffocating smell tickled her nostrils. She reported this to her supervisor at the post office and to the police. The supervisor waved her off. The police promised to check, but never came. Rita shrugged. Not her business, after all. Maybe they all went on vacation at the same time, though what kind of vacation in November? The apartment windows also continued to change, slowly but inevitably. First, they simply fogged up heavily from the inside, as if there were steam rooms in the apartments. Then, a dense yellowish film appeared on the glass, like exotic flower pollen. And then, through this cloudy opaque glass, dark blurred silhouettes began to appear. Outlines of large leaves and thick stems pressed against the glass from the inside, greedily reaching for the dim daylight, as if trying to break out. From the street, the old shabby three-story building began to look strange, frightening. The windows seemed blind, abandoned, uninhabited, though all the residents, as it later turned out, were inside. But there was one person who could not come to terms with the silence and strange smell. Dr. Harrison, an elderly local physician from the district clinic, a man of the old school, accustomed to knowing all his patients in the area. He had come to see Amy's son Tyler when the boy fell ill. The diagnosis of vitamin deficiency he had given out of desperation. The child had no obvious symptoms of illness, except extreme lethargy and apathy. But something in the atmosphere of Amy's apartment had disturbed him then. Too quiet, too dark, and this strange, obsessive, sweet smell. Amy herself had also looked unhealthy, pale, twitchy, with a feverish gleam in her eyes. Dr. Harrison prescribed vitamins and advised more walks, but an unpleasant residue remained in his soul. A week later, he decided to visit them again to check on the boy's condition. Amy's phone didn't answer. Dr. Harrison came himself. No one opened the door, though he was sure he heard some quiet rustling behind it. The smell in the building had become unbearable, thick, nauseating sweet. He went up a floor, rang Margaret's apartment. The same silence. He rang Dorothy Mill's apartment. The same silence. He went downstairs, feeling approaching nausea and weakness. Something was very wrong. This was not like a usual autumn flu epidemic. He returned to the clinic and tried to share his fears with the head doctor, but she just waved him off. Don't invent things, Samuel. You always have something happening in your district. Maybe people just went away. But Dr. Harrison couldn't calm down. He decided to contact the health department, but for an official request, he had no grounds, only suspicions and a strange smell. Finally, Maggie's sister Linda from Portland sounded the alarm. For the last few weeks, she had been unsuccessfully trying to reach Maggie. At first, Maggie answered rarely and somehow strangely, carrying some nonsense about a new flower and found peace. Then she stopped answering altogether. Concerned, Linda, knowing her sister's isolation and loneliness, began calling her colleagues and the building management. But no one could say anything definite. Colleagues reported that Margaret had been on sick leave for a month, but they couldn't reach her either. The building management indifferently replied that the apartment had unpaid bills. Then Linda, feeling inexplicable anxiety, called the police. She hasn't been in contact for over a month, she explained to the duty officer with a trembling voice. She's lonely, withdrawn. Her husband died, her son is abroad. What if something happened to her? A heart attack or something? Please check. A patrol car, two tired, sleepy men in worn uniforms, elderly Sergeant Peterson and young Officer Mitchell, arrived at the given address without much enthusiasm. Just another call, they thought. The woman probably left to visit someone, had a fight with relatives, and doesn't want to communicate. But something about the atmosphere of the building made them alert even on the street. Absolute silence, not a sound from the windows. Dark or overgrown from the inside windows. Neglect. And this strange, unusual smell. Weak here on the street, but persistent, nauseating sweet, like from rotting exotic fruits or cheap perfume. Third floor, apartment 12, Officer Mitchell said, checking the address on his tablet. Strange place. Let's go, Peterson. Climbing the dark, dirty stairs, they immediately noticed the stuffed mailboxes and other oddities. Dusty landings were littered with garbage, cigarette butts, empty bottles. Clearly, no one had cleaned for a long time. The silence was so pressing it hurt their ears. Their own coughing seemed deafening. The higher they climbed, the stronger this cloying, suffocating smell became. On the third floor, it was almost unbearable. Hey, anyone home? Police, open up. Peterson loudly banged his fist on the door covered with old cracked vinyl of apartment 12. No answer. Only the smell here, right at the door, became even thicker, more concentrated. It seeped from under the door, from the keyhole, and from cracks in the frame. Margaret Coleman, open up, police. Mitchell tried to shout, covering his nose with a handkerchief. Silence. Dead, viscous silence. Well, Peterson, should we break it down? Looks like they won't open. Peterson, grunting, nodded. He was shorter but stronger. He stepped back a couple of steps, ran up, and hit the door with his shoulder near the lock. The wood cracked dully. Another blow, the lock clinked pitifully. A third blow, and the old unreliable lock flew out completely. The door creaked open inward, releasing a thick wave of warm, humid, suffocating, sweet air. What they saw in the semi-darkness of the hallway made both policemen, who had seen everything in their careers, freeze on the threshold, forgetting about instructions, protocol, and their own safety. The apartment was drowning in thick greenish twilight. Daylight barely penetrated through windows completely overgrown from the inside, with a dense swaying mass of dark green and blue-black leaves. All visible space, walls, ceiling, furniture, floor, was entwined with supple glossy shoots of some monstrous plant. They hung from the ceiling in heavy vines, formed bizarre grotesque arches, covered the floor with a soft, springy living carpet, hiding the parquet and furniture beneath. A thick, almost visible haze of golden pollen hung in the air, settling on their uniforms, on their faces, getting into their eyes and noses. The heavy narcotic aroma was so strong it immediately caused nausea, dizziness, and strange weakness in their legs. Everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, on the buried furniture, huge velvety flowers bloomed, blue-black with thin golden veins, predatorily opening their dark maws. They faintly phosphoresced in the twilight, emitting the main smell. Holy hell, Peterson exhaled, covering his nose and mouth with his sleeve and stepping back onto the landing. What the hell is this? Some kind of jungle or hell? Look, Peterson, Mitchell said quietly, pale as a sheet, pointing deeper into the room toward the living room. There, in the center of this terrible pulsing greenhouse, in an old sagging armchair with its back to the entrance, sat a woman. Or rather, what remained of her. Carefully stepping on the slippery stems, the policeman went around the chair. The woman was impossibly thin. Her skin had an unhealthy parchment, grayish tint. Her emaciated body was completely entwined with thin stems and roots of the plant, as if she were a statue overgrown with ivy. They wrapped around her arms, legs, neck, torso, growing directly into the skin, which was black and shiny where they touched. Blue-black flowers bloomed directly on her shoulders, on her chest, on her knees. One particularly large and disgusting, one had grown through her half-open mouth like a black tongue. Shocked to their core, the policemen hastily retreated to the landing, slamming the door behind them. Mitchell turned pale and convulsively swallowed, fighting nausea. Peterson took out a cigarette with shaking hands but couldn't light it. He called for backup, reinforcements, emergency services, the investigative team, paramedics, and after thinking, representatives from the health department. Half an hour later, all services had arrived at the house. The building was cordoned off with red and white tape. Curious onlookers from neighboring houses were politely, but insistently asked to disperse. They began opening other apartments in the building, starting from the bottom up. The picture repeated with horrifying methodical precision. Dorothy Mill's apartment on the second floor. She lay on the sofa in front of an old television, the screen of which was covered with a thick network of shoots. Flowers had grown through her colorful house robe and sagging skin. On the nightstand next to her stood a cup of unfinished tea, also entwined with stems. The expression on her face was also blissful, detached, and peaceful. Frank Rodriguez's apartment on the third floor. The old man sat in his favorite chair by the window, dressed in his dress uniform with metal ribbons, apparently having been going to a parade or veterans meeting. Stems wrapped around his straight, still military-bearing body like an honor guard. And the largest, blackest flower bloomed on his chest, where medals for bravery once sparkled. His face was stern even in death, but his lips were touched with the same strange, peaceful smile. In each apartment reigned the same blue-black giant, the mother plant like the one Maggie had brought home. And dozens, hundreds of small shoots broke through cracks in the floor, from baseboards, from ventilation grates. The preliminary cause of death for all residents was the same: extreme exhaustion and asphyxiation due to the penetration of a foreign biological object. Experts, criminologists, and health department specialists in white protective suits and respirators carefully took samples of plants, air, pollen, and tissue fragments from the deceased, trying to determine the nature of this nightmare. The house was cordoned off for a long time. The building's windows were boarded up with thick wooden boards marked danger, quarantine. Residents of neighboring buildings were temporarily relocated. The question of complete chemical disinfection of the entire building, or even its demolition, was being decided. But everyone who had been inside the building that day, the policemen, rescuers, doctors, experts, who had seen those quiet apartments overgrown with black flowers and the peaceful, blissful faces of the dead, woke up for a long time at night in a cold sweat from the suffocating smell, cloying weakness, and the phantom sensation of grasping velvety stems on their skin. And somewhere far away, on the other side of this or another city, on a windowsill in an ordinary apartment, a lonely woman tired of life lovingly watered a small dark shoot in a simple clay pot, which a very pale acquaintance with a strange wandering smile and burning eyes had given her on the street a couple of days ago, saying it brings peace and happiness. "Grow, my dear," the woman whispered, inhaling the barely perceptible but so pleasant sweet aroma emanating from the tiny velvety leaves. "How beautiful you are, special. You'll be my friend." Financial quicksand is a devious thing. It doesn't resemble a cliff that you fall off with a scream. No, it's more like being trapped in mud. At first, you're just ankle deep, confident that you'll take a step and climb out. Then you notice you're knee deep and moving has become harder. And then, one beautiful day, the cold realization hits that you're sinking chest deep. Breathing is difficult, and any careless movement only speeds up the descent. My quicksand consisted of 3 components: a failed startup that had consumed all my savings, and then some student loans that grew like cancer with compound interest, and a sick grandmother in Oregon who needed medications that cost more than a luxury car payment. My work as a web developer brought in steady, but modest income enough to keep me from starving, but nowhere near enough to dig out of this pile. The final straw came when my landlord raised the rent on my tiny studio apartment in Lincoln Park. Mrs. Peterson, a sweet woman with the eyes of an IRS agent, delivered this news with such casual ease, as if she were offering tea. The realization hit. I was completely screwed. One more month and the street would become my new home. The frantic search began. 2 weeks were spent in the digital hell of rental websites. There were grandmotherly options with floral wallpaper and the smell of mothballs that had soaked into the very walls. Bedbug-infested places with questionable neighbors where the price for a room equaled the cost of a kidney on the black market. Trendy lofts where the word loft meant bare concrete and rebar sticking out of the walls. Despair became my constant companion. It sat beside me while I drank cheap coffee and peered over my shoulder at my laptop screen. And then in the third week of searching, when my willingness to give up and crash on Mike's couch had become almost absolute, it appeared on the screen. The listing glowed like a lighthouse in a storm. Room for rent in spacious vintage building, downtown, quiet neighbors, amazing price. The last word wasn't from the listing, my brain had added that. The price was indeed amazing. Absurd. For such money in this neighborhood, you couldn't rent even a closet. I reread the listing 3 times looking for the catch. A typo. Scammers who would ask for prepayment and disappear. A room overlooking the wall of a garbage incinerator. A phone number was listed. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed. What did I have to lose? 10 minutes of time. "Hello," answered a male voice, slightly out of breath, as if the person on the other end had just finished running a marathon. "Hi, I'm calling about the room listing." "Oh yes, yes, yes." The voice instantly became honey-sweet and fawning. "Wonderful room, it's still available, you're in luck. When could you take a look? Right now would be perfect, I'm actually here. Write down the address." 40 minutes later, I found myself standing in front of a massive door of a 1920s building. The lobby greeted me with coolness, the smell of old stone and dust. The stairwells were wide, the railings made of real heavy wood, polished to a shine by millions of touches. Everything here breathed solidity and a bygone era. The apartment was on the 4th floor. The door, covered in cracked leather, opened before I could press the buzzer. Standing on the threshold was Ralph. He was a man in his 50s, fidgety, with darting eyes and damp palms, one of which he immediately extended for a handshake. He was dressed in a slightly wrinkled suit that seemed too big for him, but his main trait was the habit of constantly licking his dry lips. He did this almost after every phrase, as if lubricating his speech mechanism. "Jake, very nice to meet you. I'm Ralph, come in, don't be shy." He pulled me inside and started chattering, not letting me get a word in. "Look at this hallway, and the ceiling's 10.5 feet. They don't build them like this anymore. There's an echo, true, but that's from the spaciousness." The apartment was indeed huge. A long, dim hallway from which several doors led. The kitchen, which we looked into first, was disproportionately large with a tall window facing the courtyard. "Here's the kitchen shared," Ralph continued to chatter. "Stove, refrigerator, everything at your disposal. There's room for everyone, don't worry." He praised the apartment with such fervor as if trying to sell a palace rather than rent a room. He talked about thick walls that provided silence like a tomb, about the wonderful neighborhood, about the intellectual neighbors in the building. Listening with half an ear, I tried to find that very catch. Maybe cockroaches the size of sparrows, or do they turn off the heating in winter? "Where's my room?" I finally managed to insert. "Oh yes, of course, please." He led me to the very end of the hallway. The room was perfect, spacious, bright, with the same high ceiling and large window. The furniture consisted of only a bed, desk, and an old but sturdy wardrobe. Nothing unnecessary. Perfect. "Well, how do you like it?" Ralph looked at me with an ingratiating smile, still licking his lips. "I like it," I had to honestly admit. Very much. But Ralph, I don't understand why it's so cheap. Ralph's smile became even wider, but his eyes, on the contrary, narrowed. Taking a pause, as if gathering his thoughts for a perfectly rehearsed speech, he began to speak. Well, we've come to the main point. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. You see, Jake, this is where the whole essence lies. There's one small but very important condition. He pointed to the door opposite mine. It was massive, made of dark wood, and looked much more solid than the other doors in the apartment. There was no number or nameplate on it, just a silent, mute door. The second room, Ralph whispered, is already rented. A very specific person lives there. A genius, I won't hesitate to use that word. A scientist, I think, or some kind of high-level tech guy. I don't understand these things. He works from home on some secret project, mainly at night. And he needs absolute, complete, total silence. My gaze slid from the door to Ralph. You mean no noise at all? Especially at night, he corrected. No music, no guests, no loud phone conversations. He's very, very sensitive to sounds. Any sharp noise can throw him off track, and that, you understand, is fraught with consequences for his work. This sounded strange, but in principle explainable. There were plenty of eccentric geniuses in the world. For such a price, I could walk around the apartment on tiptoes and speak in whispers. Understood, I nodded. I'm quiet. There won't be any problems. That's wonderful, Ralph beamed, and his palm was again in mine. I was sure we'd come to an agreement. You make the impression of a very serious and responsible young man. Returning to the kitchen, he extracted a folder with documents from an old briefcase. The lease was standard. I scanned it quickly without finding anything suspicious. Amount, term, obligations of the parties, all as usual, except for one clause. It was printed at the very end, highlighted in bold and framed. 7.3. Tenant Jake undertakes not to enter into any contact, verbal, visual, or physical, with the occupant of room number 2, and not to create noise pollution that may interfere with his activities, especially during the period from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. Violation of this clause is grounds for immediate termination of the lease at the unilateral discretion of the landlord. Not to enter into visual contact, that was more interesting, so I couldn't even see him. Another quirk of the genius, Ralph explained with a smile, noticing my gaze. He's a sociophobe, doesn't like being looked at. You'll most likely never see him. He's like a ghost, silent and invisible. At that moment, it even seemed amusing. Living with a ghost behind the wall for half the market price was an excellent deal. The quicksand receded a couple of inches. I felt something solid under my feet. Where do I sign? Ralph handed me a pen. His fingers were cold and damp. While I was putting my signature down, he watched with an expression I couldn't decipher then. It wasn't joy from a successful deal. It was relief, as if some unbearable burden had just been transferred to my shoulders. But my joy was too great to pay attention to this. Housing found, I was saved. What a delusion that was. The first few days passed in blissful ignorance. Having moved my few belongings and arranged them in the spacious room, I enjoyed the space, high ceilings, and silence. After my previous studio, where I could hear every sneeze from the neighbor upstairs and arguments through the wall, this apartment seemed like an oasis of calm. The door to room number 2 was always tightly closed. I never happened to see or hear the mysterious neighbor, No footsteps in the hallway, no sound of running water from the bathroom, no click of a light switch. Absolutely nothing. If not for Ralph's words, I might have decided the room was empty. But gradually, strange little things began to be noticed. So insignificant that at first I attributed them to my own fatigue and distraction. In the evening after tea, I left a mug in the sink, planning to wash it in the morning. In the morning, it was found on the shelf in the drying rack, perfectly clean, dry, shining. This made me frown. Maybe I had washed it the night before automatically and forgotten. Quite possible. There was a lot of work, my head was spinning. A couple of days later, the story repeated with a plate. Then a smell appeared. It arose only at night, barely perceptible, strange, unlike anything. It wasn't a household smell, not food, not perfume, not cigarette smoke. It most resembled the smell of air after a strong thunderstorm. Sharp, metallic, the aroma of ozone, or maybe the smell of old overheated electronics, some complex equipment. Seeping through the hallway, it tickled my nostrils and disappeared without a trace by morning. I decided that the genius behind the door had some powerful equipment running. It seemed logical. The book I was reading before bed was lying on the kitchen table. In the morning, it was found on the bookshelf in my room. Not just placed, but inserted perfectly evenly in the center between two other volumes, like an exhibit in a museum. This was harder to attribute to absent-mindedness. I distinctly remembered that it had been left on the kitchen table. Could the invisible neighbor be coming out at night and tidying up? Maybe he was obsessive-compulsive. This explained both the washed dishes and the book on the shelf. The thought that someone was touching my things while I slept was unpleasant, but not frightening. Rather, it caused awkwardness. I had to be more careful about cleaning up after myself, trying not to leave anything in the common areas. About 2 weeks passed in this strange, sterile silence. I got used to it. The habit of walking on tiptoes, closing doors without slamming, speaking on the phone in an undertone. Silence became the background of life, thick, viscous, almost tangible. And then it was broken. It happened on a Wednesday. I was delayed at work and managed to return home only after midnight, exhausted to the limit. My only desire was to collapse into bed. Going to my room and putting my phone to charge on the nightstand, I clumsily brushed the wire with my hand while undressing. The phone slipped off the nightstand and with a deafening crash slapped onto the parquet floor. In the deathly silence of the apartment, this sound rang out like a gunshot, like an explosion. My body froze, my heart plummeted somewhere into my heels. It seemed that even the neighboring houses had heard this crash. My gaze instinctively darted to the door of my room, and then to the wall behind which room number 2 was located. And at that very second from there, from behind the thick wooden wall, came a sound. It wasn't a scream, not curses, not a groan. It was a short, sharp, creaking hiss, similar to the sound made by an overheated iron when you drop water on it, or a pressurized exhale passed through some mechanical filter. The sound was quiet, but in the absolute silence, it pierced like an icy needle of fear. Completely inhuman. I had to stand in the middle of the room, not breathing, and listen. There were no more sounds. Silence closed in again, becoming even denser and more hostile than before. I picked up the phone. The screen, fortunately, turned out to be intact. Hiding under the blanket, I couldn't fall asleep for a long time, listening to the silence behind the wall. The hissing creak still rang in my ears. In the morning, getting ready for work, I had to face the consequences of my transgression. The charging cable that had been lying on the floor at night was neatly coiled, but not just coiled. It was tied into several incredibly tight, small, intricate knots. When I tried to untie them, my fingers wouldn't obey. The knots were tightened with such force as if they had been tightened not by human hands, but by some kind of vice. The cable was hopelessly ruined. Looking at these knots sent cold sweat down my spine. This wasn't just hooliganism. This was a message. Passive-aggressive, angry, evil. My warning, you broke the rules. Do it again and it will be worse. Fear, which until then had been only a light, phantom anxiety, began to take shape. It stopped being abstract. Now it had a sound hissing and a handwriting tight, untied knots. All day at work, I couldn't concentrate. The image of the ruined cable and the sound behind the wall wouldn't leave my head. Who was he, this neighbor? What was he? Obviously not just a sociophobic scientist. A normal person, even the most irritable genius, would have knocked on the wall or written a note, but wouldn't have ruined someone else's things in such a sophisticated way. Returning to the apartment was creepy. It no longer seemed like a quiet haven. Now it was a cage with an unknown beast that I had accidentally irritated. The door was opened with my key, and I had to freeze on the threshold. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. That evening, I decided I needed to talk to someone. I needed confirmation that I wasn't going crazy. The next day, Saturday, I deliberately waited for a neighbor from the lower floor on the stairwell. It was an elderly woman I'd seen a couple of times in passing. Mrs. Rodriguez, a typical sweet old lady, gray hair gathered in a bun, kind smile, grocery bag in her hands. "Hello, Mrs. Rodriguez," I began as friendly as possible. "I'm your new neighbor from upstairs, Jake." "Oh, hello, dear." She gave me a tired but warm smile. "I saw you moving in. How are you settling in at your new place?" "Everything's fine, thank you. Very quiet." I very carefully cast my line. "Oh, quiet." The smile slipped from her face. She suddenly became very serious and looked around as if afraid someone might overhear us. "In that apartment, dear, it's always quiet. Only the tenants don't stay long. They all move out somehow suddenly. Here one day, gone the next." Her words made my heart skip a beat. "Why is that?" "The owner, Ralph, he said there's a scientist living there. Very quiet." Mrs. Rodriguez's face twisted. It wasn't just fear. It was a mixture of fear, disgust, and some kind of ingrained, helpless hatred. She crossed herself with a quick, small movement. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "A scientist? That devil Ralph, what's he up to?" "No, dear, there's no scientist there. That thing has always been there as long as I can remember, and I've lived in this building since it was built. It was always there, and when Ralph inherited the apartment from his parents, he started moving people in next to it, one after another." Looking at her, I felt frost creeping up my skin. "What do you mean, moving people in? Why?" "I don't know, dear, and I don't want to know." She lowered her voice even further. "They say it's calmer that way when there's someone living nearby, like a battery for it or something, or a barrier. You just remember one thing, son, never make noise. Never make noise, especially at night. It doesn't like that terribly, and don't try to talk to it or open the door. Previous tenants were different. Some didn't believe either." She didn't finish, again looking around fearfully at the door of my apartment upstairs. She quickly nodded to me, and almost shuffling, disappeared behind her door. I was left alone on the stairwell, stunned by her words. Battery, barrier. These words beat in my head like a trapped bird. What nonsense. A crazy old woman who'd heard too many scary stories. Right. Returning to the apartment, the first thing I did was call Mike. My best friend, the same one I owed money to. Mike was a programmer like me, but unlike me, he was a pragmatist to the bone. A skeptic, a cynic, a person for whom only what could be touched, measured, and explained from a scientific point of view existed. He was my anchor in the world of logic. Mike, hi, got a minute? For you always, came his cheerful voice. What's up? Judging by your tone, either you won the lottery or debt collectors came to see you. Worse, I exhaled. Mike, I think I'm living next to some kind of hellish thing. Stammering, mixing up words, I told him everything. About the suspiciously cheap rent, about the invisible neighbor, about the washed dishes, about the hissing behind the wall and the knots on the cable. I finished with a retelling of the conversation with the crazy old lady. There was a pause on the other end, and then Mike burst out laughing. Loudly, heartily. Jake, are you serious? Come on, man, you're just overworked. You're stressed, in debt, and your roof is slowly coming off. Well, let's break down your horror story by facts. And he began methodically, coldly, like debugging code. Washed mug neighbors got OCD, it happens. Book on shelf, same thing. Ozone smell, the guy's got an air ionizer or some server rack that's heating up. Hissing short circuit. Knots on the cable, okay, I'll admit that's weird, but it only proves one thing, your neighbor is a psychopath and sociophobe. Vindictive and petty, that's how he punished you. And the old lady, Jake, she's probably 100 years old. Senile dementia, urban legends. Every old building has its own cursed apartment. His logic was flawless, ironclad. Every fear found a rational, down-to-earth explanation. Just be quieter, and that's it, he finished his analysis. For such a price, you can put up with a weirdo behind the wall. The main thing is don't wind yourself up, or you'll start seeing devils in the corners soon. I hung up with mixed feelings. On one hand, I felt a little better. Mike was convincing. A psycho-sociophobe was unpleasant, but not deadly. On the other hand, the icy lump of fear in my stomach didn't go anywhere. Mike hadn't heard that hissing. He hadn't seen Mrs. Rodriguez's face. He didn't feel this oppressive, living silence. I realized that I was alone with this problem. No one would believe me. I was a paranoid who was winding himself up because of stress. But the entity behind the wall seemed to sense my fear and doubts. It became bolder. One evening, returning home, I immediately felt that something was wrong. The apartment was abnormally cold. Not just cool, but precisely cold, like in a cellar. At the same time, the central heating radiators were burning hot. Walking through the rooms and checking the windows, all were tightly closed. The cold seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But it was felt most strongly in the hallway, near the door to room number 2. From it came a grave chill. Quickly darting into my room, I closed the door. It was warmer here. Sitting at the desk and trying to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not with eyes, but with something else. As if the entire space of the apartment had turned into a single organism, and this organism was now focused on me. My gaze fell on the windowsill. A fly lay there, dead. But it wasn't just dead, it was desiccated. Empty, gray, chitinous shell, fragile as parchment. as if all the moisture, all the life had been sucked out of it to the last drop. It lay in the very spot where a couple of days ago I had seen it alive, beating against the glass. Looking at this fly, everything finally clicked in my head like puzzle pieces that until then hadn't wanted to connect. Suspiciously low price, strange contract, fidgety, lying Ralph. Mrs. Rodriguez's words. It was always there, moving people in one after another. Like a battery or barrier, hissing, knots, inhuman cold and the desiccated fly. This wasn't a psychosociophobe and not a genius scientist. What lived behind the door was something else. Ancient, inhuman, and hungry. And I wasn't just a tenant. I was part of the conditions, part of the deal Ralph had made. My task wasn't just to live here. My task was to be here, to be quiet, unnoticed, a living buffer, to create the illusion of a normal residential apartment. Perhaps my quiet, measured life, my warmth, my life energy served this creature as something like a sedative or food. I was expendable material, a battery. The realization of this truth wasn't like fear. It was something greater. Cold, paralyzing understanding that you had fallen into a trap with rules you didn't know, and that your life wasn't worth absolutely nothing. You were just a detail in someone else's horrible mechanism, and when you broke, they would simply replace you with a new one. Sitting in my room until dawn without turning on the light, I stared at the desiccated fly on the windowsill. The silence in the apartment no longer seemed like simply the absence of sound. Now it was audible. It was heard breathing. Fear is a strange thing. At first, it paralyses. You sit, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. But if you sit like that too long, fear begins to mutate. It burns out like a burned wire, and in its place remains only ash. Burned out, angry, desperate determination. When there's nothing left to lose, fear disappears too. I spent another 3 days in this state, 3 days of hell. I almost couldn't sleep. Every rustle made me start. The cold in the hallway became constant. After sunset, I stopped leaving my room. I sealed the gap under the door with a damp towel. I ate canned food brought from the store and drank water from the tap in the bathroom, which could be reached in 3 seconds. The apartment had become my personal prison. The entity behind the wall seemed to sense the panic. It was no longer hiding. At night, sounds began to be heard. Quiet, barely distinguishable, but from this even more eerie. Sometimes it was that same creak, similar to slow scratching with claws on wood from the inside. Sometimes it was a low, vibrating hum that made the windows shake and teeth ache. It lasted several minutes and then suddenly broke off, leaving behind a ringing, heavy silence. I understood that I couldn't last long like this. Either madness, or one day it would simply decide that it no longer needed the buffer and would open the door. Mrs. Rodriguez's words about suddenly disappearing tenants no longer seemed like the ravings of a madwoman. The boiling point came on the last night. Lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I listened to the hum. It began around 2 in the morning. Low, oppressive, it seemed to penetrate into the very bones. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't outside, it was inside. And suddenly, through this hum, something new was heard. A thin, high, almost inaudible sound resembling crying or laughter. It was impossible to make out. It came from behind the wall and was so alien, so wrong, that nausea rose. That's it, enough. At that moment, something inside me broke. The fear that had been accumulating for weeks collapsed. and exploded into pure, furious anger. Anger at Ralph, who had shoved me into this meat grinder. Anger at the thing behind the wall that had turned my life into a nightmare. Anger at myself for cowardice and stupidity. I couldn't take it anymore. Disappearing quietly like my predecessors wasn't in my plans. If I was destined to perish here, then at least my exit would be loud. My body jumped up from the bed. My heart was pounding like crazy, but this was no longer panic, it was adrenaline. Opening the wardrobe door, I yanked out an empty cardboard box. I began packing noisily, demonstratively. A stack of books flew into the box, thudding against the cardboard bottom. I noisily pulled out a desk drawer and began sweeping all sorts of junk from it. Every movement was sharp, loud, defiant. A metal tripod from a camera fell to the floor, rolling across the parquet with a clang. I kicked it with my foot. Into the silence flew a cry, not words, but sounds. The main rule was being broken with a crash. The contract was being torn to shreds. The hum behind the wall immediately stopped. There was absolute, deafening silence, so dense it seemed you could touch it. For a second I froze, expecting a reaction. Hissing, creaking, the reaction came, but not quite what I expected. In the pocket of my jeans thrown on the desk, my phone vibrated. A call. Ralph's name lit up on the screen. An evil, crooked grin appeared on my face. So he was watching after all, or being reported to. Swiping my finger across the screen, I brought the phone to my ear. Hello. I tried to sound as firm as possible. Jake, Ralph's voice on the other end, was unrecognizable. Not a trace of his fawning, honey-sweet friendliness remained. Now it was icy, steely, angry. What do you think you're doing? I'm moving out, Ralph. I cut him off. Right now. You can't move out, we have a contract, he hissed into the phone. I asked you to be quiet. You're violating the conditions. Stop this noise immediately. I don't give a damn about your contract, I screamed, no longer restraining myself. All the anger and fear spilled out in this scream. And your fucking genius behind the wall. I'm leaving. You can look for a new battery. There was a pause in the phone. Long, ringing. I could only hear my own heavy breathing. And then Ralph spoke again. His voice changed once more. The ice and anger were gone. Only terrible, detached calm remained. The calm of a surgeon stating a patient's death. Well, that's very unfortunate, he said slowly, emphasizing each word. After another short pause, he pronounced the words that made my blood freeze in my veins. Now these are no longer my problems. And he hung up. I stood in the middle of the room with the phone in my hand. Silence in the receiver. Silence in the apartment. But this was no longer the silence from before. This was the calm before the storm, the premonition of something inevitable. And then came the sound I feared most in the world. Loud, distinct click of an old lock. It came from the hallway, from the door of room number 2. The lock opened from the inside. I froze, turning into a pillar of salt. All my muscles turned to stone. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My gaze was riveted to the ajar door of my room, behind which a piece of the dark hallway was visible, and that other, forbidden door. It began to open, slowly, without a single creak, absolutely silently. The door of dark wood smoothly went inward, letting nothing into the hallway. There was no room behind it. No furniture, no window, no person. Behind it was darkness. Absolute, unnatural, primordial darkness. It wasn't simply the absence of light. It was something material, It seemed to suck in the dim light from the hallway, devouring it like a black hole. From this opening in reality came a grave cold, so strong that vapor began to come from my mouth. And that same smell, ozone, overheated metal, and damp, freshly dug earth. This darkness had no form, no silhouette. There was only a sensation of something huge, unimaginably ancient, and unbearably hungry. Something that had been sleeping restlessly behind a thin partition and had just been awakened by an idiotic, loud rebellion. The contract was terminated. The buffer was no longer working. It was awake, and it was here. In such moments, the brain shuts down. All thoughts, plans, anger, despair, all of this burns up in one instant, leaving only the bare animal base. An instinct as old as the world that screams one single word: run. Heroism wasn't in my plans. I didn't want to look at what would come out of that darkness. I didn't want to know what form it had. My body reacted before any thought could form. The bag with things, still in my hand, fell to the floor with a dull thud. This sound seemed to break me out of my stupor. Turning on my heels so sharply that I almost lost my balance, I aimed for the exit at the other end of the hallway. The front door, salvation. The start was instantaneous. The parquet boards creaked under my feet. I couldn't look back, didn't dare. But I felt with my back how the cold from the doorway of room number 2 was crawling after me down the hallway, like an invisible icy tentacle. It touched my back, neck, the back of my head. The air around me became thick and cold. It was hard to breathe, as if I was running underwater. The smell intensified. Ozone, earth, and something else. Something sweetly nauseating, like the smell of rotting meat. Here it was, the door, the life-saving door covered in leatherette. Crashing into it with my shoulder, my hands frantically fumbled in my pocket. Key. Where was the key? It always stayed in the keyhole from the inside. My fingers wouldn't obey, they were like wood. Finally, the cold metal was found. Turn. Another turn. The lock yielded with a heavy click. At that moment, I heard movement behind me. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was a quiet, wet, shuffling sound, as if something heavy and damp was being dragged across the floor. I didn't check. Yanking the handle toward me and flinging the door open, I tumbled out onto the stairwell, almost rolling down the steps. I didn't close the door, I just ran, but the door closed by itself. Behind me came a dull, final, heavy thud, like a coffin lid slamming shut. The sound was so final, so hopeless, that for a moment my knees buckled, but there was no stopping. I flew down the wide staircase, jumping 3 steps at a time. Past floors, past doors behind which ordinary people slept, not suspecting what nightmare lived with them in the same building. I was afraid to look back. I was afraid to see that same impenetrable darkness oozing from under the doors. Here was the last flight. The massive door of the lobby, pushing it with my whole body, I burst out onto the street into the night coolness. I stopped only 100 meters later at the corner of the street. Bending over and resting my hands on my knees, I greedily gulped the cold, damp November air. My lungs burned, my heart beat somewhere in my throat, ready to jump out. Wearing only jeans and a t-shirt, I didn't feel the cold. Adrenaline was burning me from the inside, alive. I got out. Slowly, very slowly, straightening up, I raised my head. My gaze found the windows of the 4th floor. The window of my former room was lit forgotten in the panic. In the kitchen window, dark and ominous, someone was standing. It was Ralph. He was just standing in the darkness, and his silhouette was clearly outlined against the pale night sky. He wasn't hiding. He was looking straight at me down. There was no malice or threat in his posture. He didn't look like a winner. He just stood and watched. And suddenly, as if sensing my gaze, he slowly, very slowly, shook his head. In this gesture was everything: fatigue, disappointment, reproach. He looked at me like you look at a broken tool, at a part that couldn't withstand the load and let you down at the most crucial moment, at a fuse that burned out ahead of time. Shaking his head once more, he simply stepped away from the window, dissolving into the darkness of the apartment. Standing on the empty street, I slowly realized the full horror of what had happened. This wasn't a victory, it was just an escape. The contract was terminated. The fragile balance that he had so carefully built was disrupted. A vacancy had just opened up. And there came absolute, soul-freezing certainty that tomorrow or the day after, Ralph would again iron his wrinkled suit, put on his ingratiating smile, and post a listing. Room for rent in spacious vintage building, downtown, price significantly below market. And someone else, as desperate as I was, would bite on this bait. Someone who urgently needed money and a roof over their head. Someone who would agree to a small quirk of a genius, and the cycle would begin again. And Ralph would hope that this time the part would be more durable. Now I have to live at Mike's place, sleep on an old couch in a living room that smells of dust and bachelor life. I told him everything. This time he didn't laugh. He looked at my face, at my shaking hands, at the madness in my eyes, and silently brought me a glass of water and a blanket. He didn't believe in the story about ancient evil, but he believed in the horror. For him, I was a person who had experienced a severe nervous breakdown from encountering an aggressive and inadequate neighbor psychopath. That was enough for him to take me in. I can't sleep in silence. At my request, Mike leaves the TV on in the kitchen at night. Any sharp sound makes me jump. I've developed a fear of darkness, of hallways, of closed doors. Everything was left in that apartment. Laptop with work projects, clothes, books, passport. There's not the slightest desire to go back there. I'm going through document recovery, looking for a new job, trying to put my life back together from the pieces. Sometimes at night, when I can't sleep, I open rental websites on Mike's laptop. I'm not looking for housing. I'm just browsing. I enter the familiar neighborhood in the search engine, set the filter to the lowest price. Sometimes I find it. The listing text is slightly changed. The photos are different, but it's recognizable by the absurdly low price and the phrase, "For one quiet, non-conflicting tenant." I tried writing in the comments, "Run, this is a trap, don't rent this room." The comments were deleted within 5 minutes. Once someone even called from a hidden number. They were silent on the phone, but I could hear quiet, barely audible breathing. And a familiar sound, the sound of lips being licked. I threw the phone against the wall. I can't do anything. I can't warn anyone. I'm just another crazy person in a big city telling scary stories. And somewhere out there, in the vintage building downtown, in the apartment with high ceilings, there's silence again. The fragile, artificial balance has been restored. A new tenant walks on tiptoes, not suspecting that their silence isn't just a contract condition. It's food. Well then, ladies and gentlemen, be careful when you rent housing. And if you listen to this story to the very end, leave a moon emoji in the comments. That way, we'll know how many of us listened to it all the way through. We'll meet again, as always, in the next terrifyingly interesting story. Stop here before you go any further. Empire of the Lost. That's exactly what the inscription carved into the weathered wooden sign at the entrance to the abandoned mining tunnels beneath San Francisco's Chinatown district says to every traveler brave enough to venture into these ominous underground passages. I encountered this warning once myself, and what followed was a terrifying series of horrific events that completely changed my view of this fragile world. Until now, I have never told anyone about that fateful episode in my life, which in turn troubles me so deeply that it keeps me awake at night and prevents me from eating normally. Allow me to finally lift the veil of truth about one of the most mysterious and mystical places on the planet, namely, the forgotten mine shafts beneath San Francisco. What do most people associate with San Francisco? Of course, the Golden Gate Bridge, cable cars climbing steep hills, and the vibrant culture of this beautiful city. But this magnificent city has another side to it, hidden deep underground. I'm talking about the great forgotten mines of San Francisco, a dark and gloomy underground world where millions of dreams ended during the gold rush, and where now, according to local legends, something far more sinister dwells. Now, a bit of history. The San Francisco underground mines were created back in the 1850s during the California Gold Rush. Previously, this area was riddled with tunnels where miners desperately sought their fortune. The limestone and granite extracted here were later used to build some of the city's most famous buildings. Archaeologists believe that to this day, the area of these tunnels has expanded to cover nearly 120,000 square feet, and the number of people who died in cave-ins and accidents is estimated at more than 3,000 souls. During the gold rush and later during various economic disasters, mining accidents became commonplace. Bodies were often simply left where they fell, buried under tons of rock and earth. Can you imagine what kind of energy this place has absorbed? The remains of 3,000 people left to rot in the darkness, and tourists can still see sections where the walls and ceiling are made entirely of old mining equipment and human bones from those who never made it out. Rumors and myths have shrouded those cursed tunnels, and I happen to hear from local residents a couple of terrifying stories that I will now gladly share with you. So the tourist route only covers about half a mile, but you must agree this is negligible, since the approximate length of the tunnel system extends up to 150 miles. In the other sections, where tourists are not allowed, bones and mining equipment are simply scattered in huge piles on the floor, and only the dead know the whole truth about what really lives inside, deep underground. According to legend, in the underground galleries of Richmond District, located beneath the park of the same name, a mysterious creature still dwells to this day. It possesses incredible speed and appears suddenly, as if from underground. No one has been able to properly describe the monster, whose appearance most likely ends in people's death. But eyewitnesses claimed it looks more like an ordinary shadow, except it emanates cold and a corpse-like stench. Of all the many thousands who have gone missing over the years, they found only one. In 1792, a church caretaker from Mission Dolors descended into the underground tunnels for a bottle of wine from a nearby abandoned mining camp. He never returned, which was quite strange since the caretaker knew the 5 main galleries like the back of his hand. No one could explain the fact that 11 years later, his skeleton was discovered near the entrance to the underground tunnels. The remains were identified by his clothing and the keys that still hung around the deceased's neck. But all these disappearances and legends only attract new extreme tourists ready to venture alone into the confusing labyrinth of San Francisco's forgotten mines. For example, there was published mysterious footage found in one of the tunnels, filmed in the mid-90s by a man who was exploring the mines independently. The man with the camera slowly headed deep into the underground tunnels, filming everything in his path. The deeper the operator descended, the faster his pace became. This suggests that the person was frightened and was trying to avoid an encounter with something unknown and apparently very terrifying. Soon, changing from a walk to a quick run, the person began to move further and further into the depths of the closed section of the mines, constantly looking around and checking whether someone or something was following him. The guy went so far that the ground under his feet turned to water. You could also clearly hear heavy, labored breathing and fear of something unknown hiding in the depths of the 150-mile labyrinth. At some point, the man dropped the camera, and the last thing it managed to record was the sound of rapidly retreating footsteps. Later, this video footage was indeed found by police, but this discovery, alas, could not help find the camera's owner. By the way, the fate of the operator remains unknown to this day. Listening to all these stories told by local residents of the city by the bay, while sitting in a wonderful pub sipping cocktails, I became increasingly infected with the thought of quickly heading to the great forgotten mines that at that moment were literally beneath my feet. Moreover, my 2-week vacation in San Francisco was already coming to an end, and I wanted to see as much interesting and memorable stuff as possible. And if I could also give myself a thrill, then the trip would definitely be successful and unforgettable. At least that's what I thought then, sitting in a crowded, safe bar, not even suspecting what horror I would have to endure in the future because of one wrong decision of mine. Waking up the next day after a delicious breakfast, I set off to walk through the cozy streets of San Francisco, having already forgotten about yesterday's grandiose plans that I had been building all last evening while sitting slightly drunk in the pub. And so, passing by another house, I noticed a small structure, black as coal, which was located right next to the aforementioned building. Near it was a small crowd of people, some of them standing in line, eager to finally go inside, while others were completely absorbed in listening to a person who was very colorfully narrating something to the people standing nearby. Slowly remembering my recently constructed plans, I began to approach the already growing queue. As it turned out, the black structure, of which there were quite a few in San Francisco, was an entrance to those very terrifying mines that were packed with old mining equipment, and most likely the souls of dead miners. Interested in listening to the guide's stories about the San Francisco underground tunnels, I didn't notice how a stranger approached me from the right, who, after standing next to me for about 3 minutes without taking his eyes off the storyteller, asked a question. "Are you from around here?" At first, it seemed to me that the man didn't say this to me, but after he looked at me a few seconds later, and repeated the same phrase again. I replied, somewhat taken aback. "I'm from Chicago." "Oh, Chicago. Hello there," the foreigner said to me in a friendly and completely unexpected manner. As it turned out, this was one of the so-called black guides who, for a small fee, could accompany a group of extreme travelers to the farthest corners of the mines, as far as it was possible. To be honest, I was a bit confused since the person who introduced himself as Dante was completely unknown to me. Moreover, I was in a foreign city, and trusting anyone here would be complete foolishness. But after talking with Dante for about 10 minutes, asking him all the questions that worried me, and clarifying the details of our future trip into the underground tunnels, I decided that the stranger's offer was interesting to me after all. First, the cost of services provided by the future guide was about half the price of official tour, which simply could not help but attract. Second, our route ran through a prohibited sector of the underground labyrinth, which undoubtedly added a spicy feeling of excitement mixed with increasing excitement about not being caught and then arrested, since prohibited sectors are often patrolled by San Francisco police. And third, as a rule, what they try to actively prohibit is clearly much more interesting than permitted safe routes, which I understood perfectly well. Moreover, Dante took all the risks upon himself and was well acquainted with the mines since, according to him, he had spent practically his entire life in them and had managed to be a guide for hundreds of tourists just like me. The positive answer didn't take long to come, and we, after shaking hands, finally set a date for our joint venture into the San Francisco underground tunnels. Together with me, 2 Canadians and 1 Australian also headed into the depths of the underground world. The diverse group didn't bother me at all because I was only glad that in such an ominous and terrifying place, they wouldn't talk to me much, distracting me from possible threats, whether from monsters or at least law enforcement officers. Meeting at the designated place and at the pre-agreed time, Dante greeted everyone in different languages. To my surprise, all the guys turned out to be quite soulful, and after we all got acquainted together, our guide, also in different languages, began to tell us what safety measures should be taken while underground. Mainly, these were mundane things like not picking up skulls and bones from the floor, not shouting, not drawing anything on the walls, and staying strictly together, following each other so as not to stupidly get lost. Because if you don't study the maps of the endless corridors of the labyrinth beforehand, getting out would be practically impossible. But there was also something that, I must admit, made me slightly nervous. Dante, in a quite serious tone, stated that if we heard any strange sounds coming from the depths of the mines, we would immediately be obliged to report this to him, after which our group would have to leave the Empire of the Lost as soon as possible. To our questions about what strange sounds we might hear there and who might make them, our guide briefly replied, "You'd better not know." Of course, at that moment, having heard such a statement, I could have safely turned around and gone back to my hotel. Moreover, payment, by agreement, was to be made after we got back to the surface. But unfortunately, humans are built in such a way that curiosity and the unknown often overcome fear. As you might have guessed, we were all ready for our extreme journey, but were we ready for what would happen to us in a few hours? Certainly not. As I mentioned earlier, the San Francisco mines have not 1 or even 10 entrances. There are so many of them that the authorities simply cannot control all the paths into the mysterious underground world, which we certainly could not help but take advantage of. Finally entering another ash-black structure, we saw a simple spiral staircase leading deep underground. Carefully descending it, I noticed that the sunlight that had recently been soothing and giving us warm feelings of comfort and a certain safety began to gradually fade, and it was replaced by dim, seemingly lifeless yellowish lamplight. Walking down the corridor in a tight group, one after another, we could hear only sounds of gravel crunching under our feet mixed with heavy breathing, and nothing more. Dead, grave-like silence enveloped these terrifying corridors, and sometimes, remembering the stories of local residents about the monster living somewhere in the depths of the underground world, it became somehow uncomfortable. It's one thing to listen and not believe while sitting in a safe bar where you're surrounded by lots of people. But it's another when you yourself have descended into these dark mines and are wandering here practically defenseless, like a sitting duck, and only when you've already descended inside and realize there's no way back. Only then do you start to think about whether I needed all this. After passing through gates with a warning that entry for the living is prohibited and the empire of the lost begins, we entered a well-lit section where piles of neatly stacked bones forming patterns and various arches lay. To my surprise, there were practically no tourists here, although I had repeatedly noticed huge queues of people wanting to descend into the gloomy labyrinth. According to Dante, we needed to pass through this illuminated sector as quickly as possible in order not to fall into the hands of law enforcement, since police patrols were not uncommon here. And so, once again turning in a direction previously unknown to me, a narrow, dark tunnel appeared before us, through which we all had to get to the other side, where, according to our guide, the most interesting part begins, the gloomy and forbidden zone. This tunnel was very narrow, about 3 feet high, and human skulls and bones of long-dead miners were chaotically scattered on the floor. The most terrifying thing was that we had to literally crawl over the remains of the dead, which naturally instilled horror in our hearts. But there was no way back, and absolutely everyone understood this. Our guide, meanwhile, only smiled slyly, understanding that we were currently helpless, and our only hope of getting out was he himself. At first, everything was quite good, although I honestly admit I really didn't want to go back the same way. I was counting on Dante to lead us out through another exit on the way back. But soon, crawling through all these piles of bones and skulls, I began to notice some strange cracking sounds. At first, it seemed to me that this was all my overactive imagination, or that someone had carelessly stepped on someone's skull, which, due to its age, couldn't withstand the weight and pressure and cracked. But soon the sound repeated, and in such a way that absolutely all the group members heard it, and our guide, who had been crawling ahead all this time, loudly shouted for us to hurry up together. As it turned out later, the reason for such haste was the ceiling, which was in an emergency condition. And subsequently, literally after I managed to crawl out last, it loudly collapsed right onto the remains over which we had been crawling several minutes earlier. To say that I was in wild shock would be to say nothing, because literally a few more seconds of delay, and I would most likely have added my insides to the collection of local inhabitants. Shaking off the dust that had filled the nearby corridors after the collapse, we angrily looked at our guide, who had almost killed us all. Dante, in his defense, only muttered that in all his numerous ventures into these mines, he was encountering this type of collapse for the first time, and was no less surprised than we were. Of course, no one argued with him, because we didn't need to start fighting each other while being deep underground. Moreover, only the guide knew where the exit from the shafts was located. Therefore, our entire group came to a common understanding that we should get out of here as quickly as possible, since it was unknown whether another ceiling or wall would decide to collapse on us. Naturally, there was no talk of any mood. Everyone was terribly frightened and wanted to get back outside as soon as possible, and once again feel the warm rays of sunlight on themselves. But I had a premonition that something was clearly wrong. If at first I still didn't understand what was causing my strong anxiety, then soon I noticed how Dante had dramatically changed in behavior. If earlier you could see how he confidently led our group, clearly knowing the exact route, now the guide could stand at a fork for 5 minutes thinking about which direction we should go. And perhaps we would have continued to follow him, going further and further into the depths of the endless 150-mile labyrinth. But at one point my nerves couldn't take it anymore, and I asked our guide in a stern voice, almost shouting, whether he knew where the exit from the mines was. His answer shocked us all, and a wave of panic immediately overwhelmed our entire group. As it turned out, Dante didn't know how to get back at all, because this charlatan had only one single route along which he always led people on his excursions. After the collapse, the guide tried to find a new corridor leading us to the staircase, but only made our situation worse, leading the group blindly further and deeper. Literally, after he reported this terrible news, the guys, including me, began to panic horribly. Someone started rushing from side to side, hoping to finally find the long-awaited exit, while others began shouting loudly, calling for help, and apparently hoping that at a depth of more than 60 feet, someone might hear us. Only I, standing in place, quietly listened to the chaos reigning around, and it seems it was precisely at that moment that I heard a slightly muffled, barely audible bestial howl coming from somewhere deep in the mines. At first, I thought it was just an echo of my overactive imagination raging in my head. But after the howl repeated, already much closer and more distinctly, I suddenly realized that it definitely wasn't my imagination, and something very fast and probably dangerous was moving toward us at wild speed. Dante, who had been sitting all this time squatting, leaning against the damp wall of the corridor, shouted with wild fear in his eyes for everyone to immediately stop making noise and stop. But no one was listening to him anymore. The guys, not noticing absolutely anyone around them, continued to actively make noise, not even suspecting what trouble they were calling down on all of us at that moment. In an instant, the German who had decided to go look for the exit alone, apparently not understanding how important it was to stay together, suddenly screamed horribly, as if the poor fellow was being torn apart by something terrible. The scream was so close that absolutely all members of our remaining group heard it, and the two Canadians immediately started running away wherever their eyes led them, which would become a fatal mistake for them in the future. The German's scream had already quieted by that time, and quick, distinct footsteps were heard, rapidly approaching in the direction of the people fleeing in panic. Meanwhile, Dante and I stood in place with wild fear in our eyes, only listening to how the creature, with a wild roar, was already catching up with its future victims. My brain refused to believe in everything that was happening. The legends about the mysterious creature living under San Francisco turned out to be true, and we, to our great regret, had to be convinced of this through personal experience. Continuing to stand in place, I didn't notice how Dante, taking advantage of the moment, carefully turned around and began to move away with slow, quiet steps into the unknown darkness. Everything would have gone well for him if not for one fatal accident that predetermined his future fate. Walking in the darkness and looking back, the former guide couldn't notice a bone lying on the ground, and therefore, carelessly stepping on it, it treacherously cracked and made a loud crunch that revealed the clear location of the monster's next victim. Immediately there was a loud roar, and fast footsteps began approaching in our direction. Dante screamed like a wounded animal caught in a trap, while I, squatting down and pressing against the wet and cold wall of the tunnel, covered my ears with my hands and only prayed that the creature wouldn't smell me. The one that mercilessly dealt with all the people who had recently been members of my group. A tall, dark figure resembling a human flashed past me, from which emanated cold and a corpse-like stench. Predictably, the creature quickly caught up with Dante, and knocking him to the ground, began to very pitifully tear the poor man to pieces. Curiosity once again got the better of common sense. I slowly turned my head toward everything that was happening. In the light of the flashlight, I was able to witness that madness that no living person had ever managed to see before. It resembled a huge, hairy werewolf, although its head looked more human, except the monster had only holes instead of ears and a nose. The terrible appearance was completed by knees turned backward and huge claws on its hands and feet, with which it easily tore human flesh, shoving pieces of meat into its horrible fanged mouth. Tears involuntarily flowed down my face, because I understood that I would most likely never see sunlight again, and wouldn't be able to breathe deeply of the fresh, clean air that I had already desperately missed during all the time spent underground. The creature, meanwhile, having quickly dealt with my former guide, suddenly raised its head and seemed to listen to the deathly silence that had reigned around. I, in turn, tried not even to breathe, not giving the terrible beast an extra clue about my location. The creature, apparently completely blind, was practically 15 feet away from me, but despite all its desire, couldn't find me. Analyzing every step down to the centimeter so as not to repeat Dante's sad fate, I slowly walked down the dark corridor in a direction unknown to me, just to get away as far as possible, not even hoping to get out of the endless tunnels of the underground world. Sometimes I still caught faint echoes of that same terrible howl that I had heard shortly before those horrific, heart-wrenching events, when our group of extreme sports enthusiasts was still alive. Periodically, I heard the sounds of that unknown beast approaching, and I would squat down and cover my ears, praying to all the gods in the world that the monster wouldn't be able to find me, and then mercilessly deal with me. Time passed, and my strength gradually began to leave my exhausted body. Moreover, my phone had long since died, and I simply had no idea how many hours I had been wandering through these cursed mines. Sometimes it seemed to me that I could hear the souls of dead miners buried here several centuries earlier. What was strange was that I understood them perfectly. They were calling me to join them and asking me to stay with them in this dark, huge crypt. Soon, the aching pain in my legs from wild fatigue finally forced me to stop and sit down, leaning against another cold wall of the corridor. After sitting like that for about 5 minutes, silently reflecting on the futility of existence, I was unexpectedly drawn into the sweet embrace of sleep. I instantly passed out. What I dreamed of then, I can no longer remember, but most likely something bright and good, because when the police patrol found me, there was a happy smile on my dirty, tired face. The beam of a flashlight that suddenly shone right into my eyes unexpectedly woke me up. I barely restrained myself from crying out, because those terrible episodes of my recent past still wouldn't leave my head. As you might have guessed, by some miracle I was discovered by a patrol checking another prohibited sector of the mines. And if not for the police, I would most likely have remained in that cursed labyrinth forever. The people who were in my group were never found, as I expected. My version of what happened with the terrible monster that lives deep underground was not believed, and after several days of fruitless interrogations, I was only fined for unauthorized entry into prohibited sectors of the mines, after which I was safely sent back home. Whether to believe this story or not is up to you to decide, but checking what really happens in the distant sections of the San Francisco underground tunnels is an extremely dangerous business. After all, by going deep into the empire of the lost, you risk becoming part of it yourself without even wanting to. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.